We often delude ourselves into believing that we are the masters of this world, that we are in total control of every space, from the familiar comfort of our homes to the colossal machines built by our own hands. Yet, sometimes, it only takes one wrong step, a fleeting moment of negligence, or a series of inexplicable events for the thin veil between our peaceful reality and a deadly abyss to vanish. Today, we will step into places no one was ever meant to enter, forgotten voids, massive industrial giants, and the hidden shadows tucked away in the heart of our bustling cities. Three individuals, three distinct fates, and three outcomes so horrific they defy belief. They never knew that the very places they chose to seek refuge or traverse would become the fatal traps that stole their final breath. What makes these stories so haunting is not just the tragedy of their deaths, but the chilling silence that preceded them. As hope faded and their cries for help became nothing more than echoes in the void, they were forced to confront a brutal truth. Sometimes, silence does not mean safety. It simply means that death is standing nearby, waiting for the moment our guard drops. Prepare yourselves, for behind every clue that seems purely coincidental lies a devastating reality waiting to be unraveled. It was the 20th of December 2019, the last day of school before winter break. For one 4-year-old Harley Dilly, it was supposed to be a day of excitement. Instead, he started his morning feeling furious. The night before, he had gotten into a heated argument with his parents, and as a consequence, they had taken away his phone. When Harley did not return home that afternoon, his parents began to worry, but they were initially cautious. Harley had a history of acting out when he was angry. In the past, he had run away to stay with friends or even slept in abandoned buildings nearby. His parents contacted his friends and the school, but no one had seen him after the final bell rang. Assuming he was just blowing off steam, they didn't call the police immediately. By the next day, however, the silence became unbearable. Without his phone, there was no way to reach him. Panic set in, and the family finally contacted the authorities. A formal search was launched, but it quickly hit a wall. There were no leads, no sightings, and no digital footprint. Weeks turned into a month. The family plastered the town with posters, begging their son to come home and assuring him that he wasn't in trouble. The entire community joined the search, scouring the streets and woods, but Harley had seemingly vanished into thin air. The break in the case came almost a month later, thanks to a vacant house directly across the street from the Dilly home. The property was undergoing renovations, so the owners weren't living there, but they had security cameras installed outside. When police reviewed the footage, they found a chilling piece of evidence: Harley walking toward the property on the very day he went missing. The police arrived at the house with the owners, who provided a key. Inside, the home was secure. All doors and windows were locked from the inside, and there was no sign of a forced entry or a struggle. It seemed impossible that anyone could have vanished inside such a contained space. The officers moved systematically from room to room, calling out Harley's name, but their voices were met only with silence. As they reached an upstairs bedroom, they spotted a jacket lying on the floor. It was Harley's, the exact one he had been wearing when he disappeared. Beside it lay a curious metal plate. Looking at the wall nearby, the officers noticed a hole high up that perfectly matched the size of the plate. It was a vent. Their first terrifying thought was that someone else might have been there, that perhaps a criminal had harmed Harley and hidden the evidence inside the walls. One of the officers grabbed a stool and climbed up to peer into the vent. Reaching in, he immediately touched something that stopped his heart. He pulled his hand back, horrified, and confirmed that a person was inside. It was Harley, and he was deceased. The investigation that followed uncovered a heartbreaking reality. The leading theory was that Harley, in a moment of frustration, had climbed onto the roof of the vacant house. Perhaps he was looking for a place to hide, or perhaps he simply wanted a vantage point away from everyone. He found the chimney, which lacked a cap, and looked down. To him, it must have looked like a simple shaft he could descend to reach the interior of the house. He climbed in feet first, unaware that the chimney was designed to be wide at the top and grow progressively narrower as it descended. About halfway down, he became stuck. Realizing the danger, he tried to maneuver. He reached the level of the internal vent, punched the metal plate off, and even took off his heavy jacket, pushing it through the hole in hopes of creating enough space to slip through. It worked, but only for a moment. As he moved further down, he became hopelessly wedged. In a desperate, panicked attempt to make himself thinner, he pulled his arms up over his head. But as he struggled to breathe, the movement caused him to shift lower into the narrowest part of the chimney. Every time he screamed for help, the air escaped his lungs, causing his chest to compress. Because the chimney was so tight, his chest couldn't expand to inhale again. He was trapped in an inescapable mechanical asphyxiation. He couldn't go up, he couldn't go down, and he couldn't take a full breath. He had been so close to his own home, in a place where no one thought to look, and he remained there until the very end. The tragedy left the entire community in mourning, a grim reminder of how quickly a moment of teenage frustration can turn into a life-ending accident. If Harley's death was a costly lesson about silent isolation, then the next story will show that even in the middle of a crowd, the line between life and death can be so fragile that it only takes a single moment of lost control. In the winter of 2002, Lower Manhattan was a bustling, vibrant place, but for 25-year-old Sean Doyle, a friendly and well-liked bartender, a single night out would turn into a scene of unimaginable horror. Sean was a young man described by his regulars as cordial, kind, and easy to be around. He lived in an apartment building not far from his workplace, sharing a home with his sister Shannon and his dog Emmett. Living just down the hall from Sean was his close friend, 47-year-old Michael Wright. Despite their age difference and a massive contrast in physical size, Michael being a much larger, imposing man, the two were best friends who spent a great deal of time together. On the night of the 13th of December 2002, Sean had just finished a demanding double shift at the restaurant. He was tired but ready to unwind and enjoy the weekend. As he returned to his apartment building, he spotted Michael and Michael's girlfriend near the entrance, preparing for a night out. When they waved him over and invited him to join them, Sean didn't hesitate. It was exactly the kind of distraction he needed. He quickly dropped his belongings in his apartment, changed into fresh clothes, and joined the couple. The trio spent the next few hours moving between bars in Lower Manhattan, enjoying the festive energy of the city. By the early hours of December 14, however, the mood began to shift. The alcohol had taken its toll, and they decided it was time to head home. Because their apartment building was only a few blocks away, they opted to walk through the quiet city streets. During the walk, something changed in Michael's demeanor. It remains unclear what exactly triggered his suspicion, but he began to believe that Sean was flirting with his girlfriend. Whatever the perceived slight, Michael became convinced of it, and his reaction was immediate and violent. Without warning, he launched an attack on Sean right there in the middle of the street. Witnesses in the nearby apartment buildings were jarred from their sleep by the sounds of a scuffle. When they looked out their windows, they saw a shocking sight: a much larger man violently beating a smaller one. As the assault continued, Michael shoved Sean with significant force. Sean stumbled backward, losing his balance entirely, and slammed into a plastic chimney cover that sat over a nearby manhole. These structures were commonly used in the city to allow steam from underground lines to escape safely and to prevent people from falling into the maintenance holes. But under the weight of Sean's impact, the plastic cover toppled over, leaving the manhole exposed. Sean fell 18 feet into the darkness of the hole. The moment he landed, witnesses heard a blood-curdling scream that would haunt them for years. The hole was not a dry maintenance shaft. It was filled with boiling water and thick, scalding steam, the result of a nearby steam main leak. Emergency responders and police arrived on the scene quickly, guided by the desperate cries echoing up from the depth. They rushed to the edge of the manhole, hoping to reach in and pull Sean to safety. But the moment they peered down, they were pushed back by a wall of intense, blistering heat. The steam was so dense and the temperature so extreme that even trained professionals couldn't get near the opening. As the steam eventually cleared, they looked down and saw Sean standing in the middle of the hole, the water reaching his waist. He was in an agony that words can barely describe. His back was arched, and he was reaching up, pleading for someone, anyone, to help him get out. The scene was utterly helpless. Police managed to shut off the steam main, and they tried lowering equipment down to him, but Sean's body was already beginning to fail from the sheer physical shock. He was unable to grab onto anything. When they considered sending someone down to strap him into a harness, they realized it was impossible even with the steam main closed. The ambient temperature inside the hole was over 300 degrees Fahrenheit. There was no way to enter the hole without suffering the same fate. For 10 excruciating minutes, the officers, paramedics, and onlookers had to stand around the perimeter of the hole, their heads bowed, forced to listen to Sean's desperate pleas for help as they faded into silence. It would take 4 additional hours for the hole to cool enough for recovery crews to enter and retrieve his body. The tragedy was so profound that Judy Medante, a renowned New York City medical examiner who performed the autopsy, later wrote in her book, Working Stiff, that Sean's death was the single worst she had ever encountered in her career. She noted that Sean's actual cause of death was being steamed alive. Most tragically, she explained that unlike fire, which can destroy nerve endings, severe steam burns do not immediately deaden the senses. This meant that Sean remained conscious and felt every moment of the horrific experience. Michael Wright was eventually charged with second-degree murder, but the memory of that night and the agonizing final minutes of a kind young bartender remains a dark, haunting chapter in the city's history. From Sean's horrifying death in the open streets to Kurt's silent entrapment deep within a steel vessel, the next story reveals that sometimes the most terrifying fate is not chaos, but being completely unheard. In 2003, 27-year-old Kurt Smith was an engineer for the German shipping company Hapag-Lloyd. Having already completed 2 successful 4-month deployments, Kurt was skilled, diligent, and eager to prove his worth. When his contract was extended for a 3rd deployment aboard the container ship CM London Express, he didn't hesitate to take it. He was a professional, comfortable with the grueling, high-pressure environment of a ship's engine room. 3 months into the voyage, the ship suffered a major mechanical failure. One of the engine's heavy pistons broke. To perform the necessary repairs, the CM London Express made an unscheduled stop in Savannah, Georgia. The engine was powered down, and Kurt, leading a crew of 7, descended into the belly of the ship. The work was intense and physically punishing. In the cramped, sweltering heat of the engine room, tempers began to flare. Kurt, under pressure to get the job done, clashed with the foreman. He felt the foreman was being lazy, and he didn't hold back from saying so. By the time the new piston was finally installed, a deep, bitter resentment had formed between Kurt and the rest of the team. Once the job was complete, Kurt dismissed the men, but kept the foreman behind to help him double-check the installation. To inspect the pistons properly, they had to access the scavenger air receiver, a massive 5-foot-long tube located right next to the engine block. The tube had access hatches on both ends, secured by heavy-duty latches known as dogs. Kurt opened his hatch, crawled inside the dark, confined space with his flashlight, and began his inspection. The foreman went to the opposite end, where he used a remote control to move the pistons into position so Kurt could see them through the scavenger ports. According to standard protocol, an inspector was supposed to examine every cylinder, a process that usually took about an hour. But Kurt was exhausted, hungry, and frustrated by the day's tensions. After rushing through his checks in a fraction of the expected time, he declared the job done. Both men exited the unit, secured their respective hatches, and went off to change, ready to leave port before a large incoming tanker took their spot. But as the ship prepared for departure at 8 p.m., a sudden realization rippled through the crew: Kurt was missing. The ship's atmosphere turned from busy to frantic. The captain sounded the alarm, and the entire crew began a desperate search. When a sailor passed the scavenger air receiver, he noticed something strange. A small, dirty rag was poking out of the top right corner of the forward hatch, and the lower two latches were not properly engaged. The sailor knew they had been having trouble getting a good seal on that hatch due to a divot in an O-ring, so he assumed someone had placed the rag there to help seal the gap and simply forgotten to lock the latches. The thought crossed his mind that Kurt might be inside, but there was a strict bureaucratic rule on board. Only the chief engineer, the foreman, or Kurt himself was allowed to open those hatches. Afraid of overstepping his bounds, the sailor played it safe. He simply closed the lower latches, securing the hatch, and reported the odd rag to his superior. Tragically, the communication broke down. When the chief engineer heard about the rag, he began making his way to the engine room. Simultaneously, the foreman had independently returned to the unit, opened the rear hatch, shined a light inside, and seeing nothing shut, and locked it. By the time the chief engineer arrived, the foreman assured him the unit was empty. The rag situation was ignored. Kurt was indeed inside. The terrifying reality, reconstructed by investigators later, was that Kurt had begun to doubt his own rushed inspection. Fearful that he would be blamed if the pistons failed again, and knowing the foreman disliked him, he decided to return to the tube alone to perform a thorough check. He wanted to do it quietly, without anyone knowing he was second-guessing his own work. He had entered the tube, but as he moved, he had accidentally slammed the hatch door shut. The heavy impact caused the upper latch to swivel and lock him in. He was trapped in a dark, 5-foot metal tomb. He had tried to scream, but the noise of the ship was deafening. No one could hear him. Seeing the tiny sliver of light at the top of the door, he had pushed his rag through the gap, desperate to signal his location. When he heard people outside, he prayed they would see it. Instead, he heard the chilling sounds of them locking the latches, sealing his fate. When the foreman opened the opposite hatch to check the unit, Kurt had been at the other end of the 5-foot tunnel, screaming in the dark, but the foreman hadn't seen him and had closed the hatch again. Kurt was left alone as the ship prepared to leave. He would have felt the air pressure shift as the engine began to churn. Then, the temperature inside the tube started to rise. The engine heat, trapped within the steel walls of the scavenger air receiver, turned the unit into an oven. Kurt Smith was cooked alive, left behind by a series of fatal misunderstandings and a rigid, unyielding chain of command. 2 days later, when the ship reached Norfolk, the foreman opened the hatch and finally found him. It was a harrowing, avoidable end to a life cut short by professional pride and the absolute silence of a steel machine. In the end, what ties these three stories together is not just how they died, but how close they were to being saved and how no one could reach them in time. Harley was only a few meters away from his own home, trapped inside a narrow space that no one thought to check. A place that should have been empty became his final prison. He didn't disappear into the wilderness or vanish into the unknown. He was right there, hidden in plain sight, slowly running out of air while the world continued on just outside the walls. The most terrifying part is imagining those final moments when panic turned into realization and realization into silence. No matter how loud he tried to scream, no one heard him. And by the time they finally found him, the house had already kept his secret for far too long. Sean's fate was even crueler in a different way. He wasn't alone. He was surrounded by people, witnesses, police, trained professionals, yet none of them could save him. He was visible, within reach, calling out for help, and still completely unreachable. There is something deeply unsettling about that kind of helplessness. To know that people are right above you, looking down, trying everything they can, and still failing. His voice, once filled with panic and desperation, slowly faded into nothing. Not because help didn't come, but because it came too late. The city that never sleeps became the place where his final screams echoed into the night, unanswered. And then there was Kurt, who didn't fall into a trap or get pushed into danger. He walked into it himself, step by step, believing he was doing the right thing. His story is perhaps the most silent of them all. No witnesses. No crowd. No desperate eyes watching from above. Just darkness, metal walls, and the growing heat. He tried to leave a sign, a small piece of cloth, a final attempt to say, "I'm here," but even that was misunderstood. Instead of saving him, it sealed his fate. The sounds he made were swallowed by the roar of the ship, and the people who could have saved him unknowingly walked away. In the end, he wasn't just trapped physically, he was erased by a system that never realized he was still inside. What makes these stories linger is not just the horror of their deaths, but the pattern they reveal. In every case, there was a moment, a single, fragile moment where things could have gone differently. A glance in the right direction. A decision to double-check. A rule broken for just a second. But those moments passed, unnoticed, and once they were gone, there was no way back. It forces you to think about all the spaces we ignore every day. The walls, the ground beneath our feet, the machines we trust, without question. We believe we understand them, that they are safe because they are familiar. But these stories suggest something far more disturbing, that danger doesn't always come from the unknown. Sometimes it's hidden in the most ordinary places, waiting quietly for the exact moment when everything goes wrong. And maybe that's the most frightening truth of all. Because none of them thought they were in danger until it was already too late. On the afternoon of the 10th of June, 1871, a defense attorney named Clement Vallandigham was sitting inside a courtroom in Lebanon, Ohio. He was listening to a prosecutor question a witness on the stand. And with every single word this witness spoke, Clement could feel the knot in his stomach twist and tighten just a little bit more. This testimony was not just bad, it was devastating for Clement's client, a man named Thomas McGahan, who was on trial for murder. The murder itself had happened about 6 months earlier on a cold Christmas Eve in the nearby city of Hamilton. That night, McGahan had apparently stormed into a saloon with a group of his friends. Their target was another man inside named Tom Myers. An attack broke out, it was loud, it was chaotic, and in the middle of all the shouting and shoving, a single gunshot rang out. When the chaos finally died down, Tom Myers was on the floor, shot and killed. Now, the problem was, there were at least 30 other people in that saloon at the time. But the fight had happened so fast and it was so confusing that not a single person could say for sure that they saw who actually fired the gun. Despite this complete lack of a direct witness to the shooting, almost everyone in town immediately decided that Thomas McGahan had done it. And to be fair, even Clement had to admit that it was a reasonable assumption to make. You see, McGahan and the victim Tom Myers had a very long and very public history of not liking each other. It was a well-known feud, and everybody in town knew they hated each other. On top of that, McGahan had a reputation. He was known as a violent criminal, and there were rumors, whispers that he had already killed at least 4 other men in his lifetime. So, when Tom Myers ended up dead after a fight with McGahan, the citizens of Hamilton didn't really feel the need to wait around for a trial. They were ready to form a mob and hang McGahan right then and there. Of course, the local police intervened before that could happen. They arrested McGahan and put him in jail to await trial. But the story of the saloon murder had already spread like wildfire all across Ohio. It was a messy, dramatic case with a notorious defendant, and as a result, the trial itself became a very high-profile event. Every single day, the courtroom was packed. Journalists from all over the state, important local figures, and curious members of the public all came to sit in the gallery and listen to the testimony unfold. And right now, all of these important people were sitting there watching Clement's defense case get absolutely obliterated by this one single witness. The witness on the stand was one of the men who had been in the saloon on the night of the murder. And he was making a very, very big claim. He was telling the court that even though nobody saw McGahan fire a gun, he was certain McGahan was the shooter. The witness said that right after the gunshot went off, he looked over and he saw a little puff of smoke coming out of McGahan's jacket pocket. The implication was clear. McGahan had his gun hidden inside his jacket, and he had fired it through the fabric to conceal the weapon. As the witness explained this theory, Clement looked around the courtroom. He saw people in the jury box nodding their heads. He saw journalists in the gallery scribbling furiously in their notepads. It was clear that everyone was buying it. What the witness said seemed to make perfect sense to them. At that point, Clement could tell that basically everyone in that room thought his client was guilty. But Clement did not agree. He knew his client's case looked terrible. He knew the public opinion was stacked against him. But Clement was absolutely certain deep down in his gut that Thomas McGahan was innocent. Clement had his own theory about what had happened that night in the saloon. He believed that the victim, Tom Myers, had actually shot himself by accident. He thought that during the chaotic brawl, Myers had tried to pull out his own gun to defend himself, but in the struggle he fumbled it and the gun went off, killing him. Unfortunately for Clement, this was 1,871. There was no advanced forensic science. There were no ballistics experts or gunshot residue tests. The only piece of physical evidence in the entire case was a few scorch marks on Tom Myers' shirt where the bullet had entered. So, the whole trial was really just based on what the witnesses said, and this particular witness was being very, very convincing for the prosecution. The prosecutor finished up his questioning with a confident flourish. He walked back to his table with a little smirk on his face, like he knew he had just landed the winning blow. He had pretty much just won the entire case with that one testimony. Now it was Clement's turn to cross-examine the witness. And honestly, he had no idea how it was going to go. He felt like he was facing a brick wall. But as Clement stood up from his chair and started to walk across the courtroom floor, a strange sense of calm came over him. He was thinking to himself, I really don't have that much to lose here. Pretty much everyone in this state already thinks my client is a murderer. So if he's found guilty, nobody is going to be shocked. But maybe, just maybe, I can find a way to prove he's innocent. And that would be a huge victory. And if I don't, well, it is what it is. To understand Clement's mindset, you have to know that he was a very controversial figure in Ohio at that time, which was right after the end of the Civil War. During the war, he had been a very vocal opponent of the president, Abraham Lincoln. His political viewpoints had actually gotten him banished from Ohio and the other northern states for a time. After the war ended, he was allowed to return to his home state of Ohio, and he went back to practicing law. But he had never really been able to fix his damaged public image. Even now, 6 years later, a lot of people in Ohio still really hated him for his behavior during the war. So in his mind, Clement knew that losing this case wasn't going to change much for him personally. Nothing would really change. He'd still be the guy that a lot of people disliked, and his client would be the convicted murderer everyone already thought he was. It is what it is. But if he won, if he could somehow pull off an acquittal in this impossible case, he could completely reinvent himself. He would no longer be the disgraced politician. He would be known as the sensational criminal defense lawyer who could overturn even the most hopeless cases. And again, he genuinely believed his client was innocent. So this would be a major victory on two fronts for Clement. It would be a professional triumph and a personal vindication. So, with this renewed sense of purpose, Clement stepped up to the witness box. He began firing off one question after another at the witness. By the end of the day, Clement had managed to get that witness to admit that he hadn't actually seen a physical gun in McGeehan's hand or in his pocket. He had only seen the smoke. Then, Clement delivered his final blow to the prosecution's theory. He had the jacket that McGahan had been wearing that night brought into the court as evidence. He showed it to the judge and the jury, and he was able to prove that there was no hole anywhere on it. Not a single tear or burn mark. The jacket shooting theory was completely destroyed. As the week went on, more and more witnesses took the stand. Clement was pleased to find that none of them had any actual proof that McGahan had shot Tom Myers. But, on the other hand, he also couldn't find any solid evidence that proved his client was innocent either. He had poked holes in the prosecution's case, but he hadn't built a strong case of his own. So, later that week, on Friday, June 16th, as the trial was coming to a close, Clement was starting to get worried again. He knew that he had done a lot, but he also knew it probably wasn't enough to get his client acquitted. And even though he knew the odds were always stacked against him, he now felt like victory was possible. It was almost within his grasp, and now it felt like it was slipping through his fingers. That afternoon, Clement sat behind the defense table, sweating under his collar as he listened to the prosecutor's team deliver their closing arguments. And they were brutal. They painted McGahan as a cold-blooded killer and tore apart every little bit of doubt Clement had tried to create. This was giving Clement a lot of anxiety. He was just moments away from having to give his own closing arguments. This was his very last chance to convince the jury that his client was innocent. But he just did not feel like the speech he had prepared was going to be enough, especially not after the powerful and convincing speech the prosecutor was giving right now. And so, as the prosecutor eloquently wrapped up his speech, Clement was furiously crossing out lines on his own notes, trying to rewrite things, trying to make it better, stronger. But nothing was coming to him. He just sat there, racking his brain, trying to think of what to say. The prosecutor sat down, and the entire courtroom fell silent. Everybody was looking at Clement, waiting for him to stand up and deliver his closing argument. And as he sat there in that heavy silence, an idea suddenly hit him. It hit him so hard that he actually dropped his pen on the floor. He didn't know why this idea hadn't occurred to him earlier. It was so obvious. He suddenly realized there was a way he could definitively prove McGahan was innocent. And if he was right, he would go down in history as perhaps the greatest defense attorney Ohio had ever seen. Clement lunged for his pen again. He frantically started scribbling down the details of his new idea. A minute later, he heard the judge call his name, telling him it was his turn to speak. And so Clement, he shot to his feet and he cleared his throat. But instead of launching into the speech he had prepared for this moment, he did something unexpected. He asked the judge to let him deliver his closing argument on Monday instead. The judge was a little hesitant at first, but after some consideration, he agreed. And when he did, Clement felt a huge surge of excitement rush through his body. After the court proceedings officially ended for the day, Clement could not get out of that courthouse fast enough. He had a plan, and he needed to put it into motion. Clement waited until nightfall to act. He needed to run a test to make sure his theory, the one he was going to present on Monday, was correct. But he didn't want anyone from the prosecution team to see him doing it. So, after having dinner with some friends, Clement slipped out of his hotel and into the quiet, dark streets of Lebanon. While he was at dinner, he had been pretty vague about what he actually planned to do that night. But he did tell his friends that they really needed to stay in town long enough to hear his big final argument on Monday. He was that confident in what he was about to uncover. He was sure his speech on Monday would be one of the greatest legal moments in the history of Ohio. And so now, as Clement made his way to the edge of town, he was filled with adrenaline. He kept walking faster and faster until he was basically at a full run. And then he finally arrived at a quiet, isolated part of Lebanon. As soon as he got there, he set up for the test he had planned, and then he ran through it. After he finished, a wide smile spread across Clement's face. He knew, without a single doubt, that he had just found a way to prove that his client was innocent. Just a few minutes later, around 9 o'clock that evening, Clement was back inside of his hotel room. He was so excited about the results of his test that he couldn't even sit down. He just kept pacing back and forth around and around the small room, trying to get his thoughts in order, but he was just too excited. His hotel room door was cracked open, and as he was pacing, he saw his co-counsel, another lawyer on the defense team, walking by in the hallway. This hotel was sort of the home base for everyone who was in town for the trial. So most of the lawyers from both the prosecution and the defense teams were staying there. When Clement saw his co-counsel, he immediately waved him inside. He tried to tell him what he had figured out, but the words just kind of tumbled out in a jumbled mess. All he really managed to get across was that the prosecution had it all wrong, and that he, Clement, had figured out the truth. But his co-counsel was just looking at him with a confused expression, like he really didn't understand a word he was saying. And so at some point, Clement realized that words weren't going to be enough. He needed to do a physical demonstration. He needed to repeat the test he had just done out in the field to actually show his co-counsel exactly what he was talking about. So, without much more explanation, Clement got up. He set up the test right there in the hotel room. He then turned to his co-counsel and told him to watch carefully. And then Clement began to perform the test. But this time, something went horribly wrong. During the demonstration, there was a sudden, loud explosion, and Clement collapsed to the ground. It would turn out that Clement's test did prove, without a shadow of a doubt, that his client really was innocent. His theory was that Tom Myers had shot himself by accident, by fumbling with his own gun. But in order to make sure his theory would hold up with the jury, he wanted to show everyone that it was definitely physically possible for that to happen. So, when Clement had gone to the edge of town to do the test by himself for the first time, he had taken a gun with him. He basically experimented with ways the accident could have happened. He shot the gun through pieces of fabric from different angles, and he looked at the resulting scorch marks. And when he did this, he realized that the scorch marks that had been left on the victim's clothes, which was the only forensic evidence they had, could have only been made if the victim was shot at point-blank range. This meant that Thomas McGahan, who was standing several feet away during the fight, was simply too far away to have been the shooter. But it was not until later, when Clement acted out the shooting again for his co-counsel in the hotel room, that his discovery went from great to perfect. Because completely by accident, he did exactly what he believed Tom Myers had done that night. He fumbled with the gun, and he shot himself. Clement died from his self-inflicted wound 12 hours later. But his death made his argument so powerful and so convincing that his client, Thomas McGahan, was eventually acquitted. So Clement had been right. This was the greatest case of his life. It was also his last. Our second and final story is about a song, but we're not going to be playing this song during the episode. And when you get to the end of this story, you'll see why. On an overcast, chilly Sunday in the fall of 1932, a 32-year-old composer named Rezo Scariest sat in his small apartment in Paris trying to write a new melody. He had been at it for hours and hours, and it was not going well at all. Each time he managed to jot down a new combination of notes, he would play it back, hate it, and then tear up the sheet of paper and toss it into his trash bin. The bin was already overflowing with a pile of other discarded drafts. Now, Rezo was used to this kind of messy, creative process. He had made a name for himself as a musician back in his home country of Hungary over the last decade. He had written more than 40 different musical compositions for various singers and artists, and a few of them had been really successful. So Rezo knew, deep down, that he had the talent to be a huge star. He believed he could change people's lives with his music. But recently, despite trying many different approaches and just letting the messy creative process happen, Rezo still could not come up with any new work that he felt was any good. A big part of the problem was that he was incredibly stressed out. At this point in 1932, Rezo and many other people were very nervous about the state of the world and what the future might hold. There were very violent and hateful political views that were spreading across Europe, especially in Germany. This was still 7 years before the official start of World War II, but Hitler and his Nazi party were already starting to gain a lot of power. And Rezo, who was Jewish, was deeply worried about all the anti-Jewish rhetoric that the Nazis were spreading. And while that was terrifying and kept him up at night, The more urgent day-to-day worry that was really blocking his creativity was a more practical one: how to literally afford to buy food. The world was also in the middle of the Great Depression, which was a period of time in the 1920s and 30s when multiple countries were dealing with terrible economies and massive unemployment. Back in Rezo's home country of Hungary, things were especially bad, and they were getting worse every day. Banks and businesses were closing down almost daily. More than a quarter of the entire population was unemployed and living in extreme poverty. Rezo had moved to Paris, hoping to find more opportunities. Paris, after all, was considered the art mecca of Europe. And even though the state of the world felt depressing and dark, Rezo thought that the creative energy in Paris would inspire him to create something beautiful in the middle of all the darkness. But now, as Rezo sighed and leaned back in his chair, he looked around his tiny, drafty Parisian apartment. He had been here for months, and his fortunes had certainly not changed. He still didn't have any work, and he still could not seem to write anything good. But Rezo, he kept trying. He would lean back over his piano and try to write, but almost immediately he would tear up the paper. He was just getting more and more frustrated with himself until finally he just gave up. He put his head in his hands and basically said out loud, "I can't do this." It seemed like the harder he worked and the harder he tried to ignore all the despair and sadness and the awful things that were going on in the world, the worse he felt. And obviously, the worse his work was. Right now, he actually almost felt physically sick from bottling up all of these terrible competing feelings and thoughts. But as he thought about the fact that he was bottling everything up, he suddenly decided he just couldn't do it anymore. He couldn't continue to keep all of that stuff locked inside. And it was at that exact moment that Rezo took a deep breath and he let in all of the anguish that he had been trying so hard to push away. Sadness and fear and a quiet sense of desperation just washed over him and into him. And this time, he didn't fight it. He just let it happen. And then suddenly, he started writing. His pen flew across the page as wave after wave of these terrible emotions hit him. When he was done, he ran over to his piano to play the notes that he had just written down. And as his fingers moved across the keys, a very slow, very sad melody began to fill the small room. It was so beautiful and so incredibly sad that he actually felt like he was going to cry just from hearing it himself. When he was done playing, he just sat back in his chair. And now, tears were filling his eyes, and his heart was pounding so fast that he knew he needed to get some fresh air, and fast, or he might actually just pass out. And so Rezo went outside to take a walk. He hoped the fresh air would help him snap out of the wild emotional fog that had just come over him. But the Paris streets were gray and cold, and this new melody just continued to ring in his ears. He was thrilled that he had actually written something real and powerful for the first time in what felt like a very long time. But it was such an intense expression of his own personal sadness that it almost hurt to have created it. Shortly into his walk, he heard somebody call his name. When he looked up, he saw it was his good friend, a poet named Yo Yavor, who was rushing right up to him. And right away, when Rezo saw his friend, he felt himself lightening up just a little bit. He liked Laszlo. They were both Hungarians living in Paris, trying to make good art and make a name for themselves, but neither of them had really succeeded yet. But as soon as Laszlo reached him, Rezo could tell that his friend seemed really upset about something too. His friend told him that his fiancée had just ended their engagement, and he was completely heartbroken. After Rezo said that he was terribly sorry to hear that, the two men just walked together in silence for a while. They were both lost in their own sad, heavy feelings, and neither of them could think of anything to say. And then, without even meaning to, Rezo just began to whistle the song that he had just written. And when he did this, it was like the tune had an immediate effect on Laszlo. His friend's eyes welled up with tears, and he sort of began to cry. And also, he began to sing along to the melody using words from a very sad poem that he himself had recently written. Rezo couldn't believe it. Without even trying, Laszlo's words were a perfect fit for his melody. And as this sort of impromptu collaboration began, the two men went from this really dark, gloomy mood to a purely excited one. They were so inspired that they rushed into a nearby restaurant to sit down and work out the rest of the song. Before they knew it, Rezo had written an entire composition with Laszlo's lyrics. The song was about someone whose lover had just died, and their deep desire to be reunited with them in the afterlife, Pakis. When the men finished, they wanted to hear their new song out loud. So they asked the restaurant's resident musicians if they would play it for them. And pretty soon, their song, something that hadn't even existed just a few hours ago, was being played throughout the crowded restaurant. And as far as Rezo and Laszlo could tell, everybody inside was loving this song. Some of the restaurant patrons actually started to cry. Others closed their eyes and just kind of swayed to the sad sound. It was exactly what Rezo had always hoped his music would do, which was to truly and deeply affect those who heard it. Rezo and Laszlo looked at each other, and for the first time in days, they both smiled. Rezo and Laszlo decided to call their song Gloomy Sunday since it had been created on that hazy fall Sunday. They both had a feeling that this particular tune was very special, and that it would finally be the thing that changed both of their lives for the better. So, over the next few months, they took the song around to different music producers and tried to get somebody to buy it. And finally, someone did. A company agreed to publish the sheet music and to record the song. After that, Rezo went back to his shabby Parisian apartment, and he waited. He waited for the song to take hold, for it to become a hit, and for the money to start pouring in. But that is not what happened. As the months passed by, Rezo didn't hear Gloomy Sunday on the radio. He didn't see it on any music charts. He didn't hear it in other restaurants or being performed in theaters. It was like the song had never even existed at all. And this completely crushed Rezo. He was even more upset and defeated than he had been before he had written it, because now he had gotten a taste of hope. And it felt so much worse to fail after that. The rest of Rezo's life, and the state of the world, got worse too. The Great Depression was still going strong. And as Hitler got more and more popular, people started to wonder if there was going to be a major war. So Rezo and pretty much everyone else around him just sank further and further into their fears and worries and kept praying for something, anything, to change. 3 years later, on a spring evening in 1935, Rezo was back in Hungary. He was walking down a street in the country's capital city, Budapest. He was on his way to a friend's house. But as he strolled down the sidewalk, he heard a song coming from an open window of a nearby apartment. He stopped cold in his tracks, and his heart began to pound in his chest, because he knew that song. It was his. It was Gloomy Sunday. Rezo had no idea how or why he was hearing his song. As far as he knew, no one had really been that interested in it. But it was completely shocking. Someone he didn't know was listening to his song on the radio. That meant it was being put out on the airwaves, that it was being consumed by the public. This was incredible. And so Rezo just stood there on the sidewalk, letting his own notes wash over him, hearing it out in public for the very first time. And when the song was done, he just stood there for another moment and just absolutely beamed with joy. After that day, for months, Gloomy Sunday was everywhere. Rezo heard it being played at social gatherings. He heard it streaming from people's windows. Street performers sang it to people passing by, and it was even performed at big concert venues all over the city. And so by the end of that year, it seemed like there was hardly anyone in all of Hungary who hadn't heard and loved his song. Rezo even read in the newspapers that his song was being played in England, in France, and as far away as the United States. So Rezo knew that he had actually done it. He had finally realized his dream of being a successful, internationally recognized composer with a hit song that truly resonated with the public. A few months later, on a morning in late February of 1936, Rezo left his apartment and was heading out for the day. And on his way down the street, he passed by a newsstand. He happened to notice that one of the headlines mentioned his song Gloomy Sunday. Initially, he was really excited to see that he was getting some press coverage. So, he immediately grabbed a copy of the newspaper and opened it up to read the article. But as his eyes scanned the page, his stomach completely flipped. Because this was not good press. In fact, what this article had to say was so terrible that Rezo's first reaction was that he must have read it wrong. And so, he read it again, and then a third time, and then a fourth time. But each time he read it, it just said the same horrible thing. And so Rezo found himself starting to panic. He quickly shut the paper and just began looking around him. He saw there were a few other people who were also standing by the newsstand, and they were reading the same paper. And they were all talking to one another in hushed, worried voices and pointing at that same headline about his song. And Rezo just stood there, listening to this unsettling murmur and feeling a wave of absolute horror wash over him. Over the next month, more and more headlines about Rezo's song continued to appear in the papers. And it was like each day, they only got worse. And then the story went international. The Catholic Church weighed in on it. And then the police got involved. Finally, one afternoon at the end of March in 1936, Rezo was sitting at his piano, just staring down at the keys. He knew he should be writing music, but instead he was just filled with a sense of dread, just like he had been every single day since he first read that dreadful headline. And then suddenly, there was a sharp knock at his door. And when Rezo got up and answered it, a cold sweat broke out all over his body because it was the Budapest police. And they wanted him to come down to the station with them. Rezo's pulse raced with nerves. But at this point, he wasn't really surprised. Because by now, he knew that writing Gloomy Sunday had been a horrific, terrible mistake. Because it would turn out, Gloomy Sunday had been a very shockingly impactful song, just as Rezo had thought he wanted it to be. But over the course of the last year, the police had begun finding its sheet music, or its written lyrics, or the actual song playing on record players at the scenes of suicides. Dozens and dozens of people across Hungary, across Europe, and in the United States, from police officers to teenagers to waitstaff to students, had taken their own lives, basically while listening to Gloomy Sunday. These deaths became so widespread that a Hungarian archbishop actually wrote a public letter to the people begging them to stop hurting themselves. And multiple official bans of the song itself were enacted across Europe and England and the United States. On the day that the Budapest police knocked on Rezo's door, they demanded that he stop all sales of the song. And Rezo immediately agreed. And eventually, so did the song's publisher and his musical partner, Laszlo. And Rezo's partner, Laszlo, was especially grief-stricken by this whole thing. Because his fiancée, the one who had broken his heart on the very day he had written the song with Rezo, she ended up being one of the many suicide victims. Before she took her own life, she sent Laszlo a telegram which simply said, "Gloomy Sunday." No one knows for sure why Gloomy Sunday potentially caused this sudden wave of death. One theory is that people were already really suffering from depression and feeling hopeless because of the Great Depression and the worsening political climate. And the song's popularity was either a terrible coincidence or it served as a sort of unfortunate trigger for those who were already on the edge. As for Rezo, he was devastated by the dark legacy of his song. Even though it did technically live up to his original vision, it did deeply resonate with people and was unquestionably a hit. It was a nightmare. Over the years, despite all the negative associations with the song, it's been translated into 28 different languages and was even performed by legendary singers like Frank Sinatra and Billie Holiday. Initially, there was an estimated 20 suicides attributed to Gloomy Sunday across Europe and the United States. In the years that have followed, however, the lore around the song has only grown, and some estimates now put the death toll in the hundreds. Although these numbers are very difficult to verify, Rezo never wrote another hit song. And in fact, ultimately, he followed in the footsteps of some of his listeners. He jumped out of the window of his 8th floor apartment on another overcast, gloomy Sunday, and he died 2 days later. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments. And remember, we have a whole playlist of true crime episodes ready for you to binge right now. Until next time, see ya. Imagine you are entering a place that time has completely forgotten, and you are walking through the doors that are heavy and quiet. Almost all of us experience an immediate feeling of unease whenever we consider the possibility of entering a building that has been abandoned. Our minds conjure up images of shadowy nooks and crannies, floorboards that creak, and the chilly, lingering sensation of being watched by something that is not visible. However, a man by the name of Dan Bell does not feel threatened by these voids in the environment. These locations hold a wealth of history, a peaceful memory, and a beauty that has been long forgotten. Dan is a very well-known creator who maintains a page that is followed by a large number of people. On this page, he shares his adventures in abandoned locations. Over the course of several years, he has invested in the development of a massive community consisting of more than 500,000 subscribers who tune in on a regular basis to watch him explore these abandoned buildings. While other people who explore these kinds of places are looking for cheap scares or sensational drama, Dan is not looking for either of those things. The use of dramatic music is not something he employs, and he does not attempt to create creepy moments for viewers to experience. The majority of his most popular videos, on the other hand, are shot in locations that have not even been completely abandoned before. Take, for instance, one of his most cherished videos, which is a peaceful stroll through a massive Kmart department store that is in the process of closing down. The shelves are completely devoid of any items, the cash registers are silent, and the aisles are completely empty as they stretch out under the fluorescent lights that are buzzing. In spite of the fact that it is a profoundly nostalgic and slightly eerie look at a location that is... Nevertheless, there is one upload that is absolutely terrifying, and it is located on his page, which contains a lot of videos that are either peaceful or nostalgic. A video with the title, The Super Creepy Abandoned Asylum, you can watch here. Due to the fact that the video is so unsettling, even other urban explorers with years of experience were deeply disturbed by it. The fact of the matter is that one of the most prominent comments on the video comes from a verified account that is highly regarded and has more than 1 million subscribers. In their writing, they expressed the possibility that this was the most unsettling urban exploration video they had ever witnessed in their entire lives. The first scene of the video shows Dan approaching a massive old structure that is in a state of disrepair and is located deep within the forest. If you were to look at this building from the outside, you would never be able to tell that it was an institution. The appearance of the structure is that of a massive old residential house that has been completely consumed by nature over the course of many years. Verdant vines that are thick and green climb up the brick walls, wrapping themselves around the windows and reaching up toward the roof. In the area surrounding the perimeter, the grass has become so overgrown that it reaches all the way up to Dan's waist. Despite the fact that it is a bright and sunny afternoon, the trees are dense and close together, which causes them to cast shadows that are strong and dark over the property. There is not a single word that Dan utters throughout the first minute and a half of the video. He does nothing more than stroll around the exterior of the building in a low-key manner, allowing the camera to capture the oppressive and hushed atmosphere of the forest. The only sounds that can be heard are the soft crunch of dirt and dry leaves beneath his boots, the occasional chirping of birds, and the gentle rustling of the leaves as they are blown by the wind. Despite the fact that it is extremely tranquil, there is a sense of tension that is building up with each step that the person takes. Dan makes his way to the side of the building after he has spent approximately 1 minute and a half exploring the entire exterior of the building. When he gets there, he sees a set of stone steps that are quite old and cracked, and they lead down into the ground. It is abundantly clear that the basement of the building can be reached through the heavy, weathered wooden door that is located at the bottom of these steps. After descending the stairs, Dan reaches out and opens the door for the visitor. The video goes through a significant visual transformation as soon as he enters the room. While the sunlight was extremely bright and intense outside, the darkness that prevailed inside the basement was completely devoid of any light. The sudden shift in light causes his camera lens to take an entire minute to adjust and focus on the environment. This is because of the sudden change in light. When the camera is finally able to adjust, the scene that is revealed can be described as extremely unsettling. You notice a lengthy corridor that is particularly narrow and extends into the darkness. It appears as though the paint on the walls is flaking off in enormous sheets of paper that are hanging down like cobwebs. The floor is completely cluttered with heaps of old, moldy clothing, trash that is scattered all over the place, and paper that is deteriorating. If you listen carefully, you can hear the loud and sharp crunch of broken glass beneath Dan's heavy boots as he begins to walk down this hallway. When Dan was first filming this exploration, he did not speak out loud at any point. He desired to maintain his silence so that he could pay attention to his surroundings and ensure his own safety. Rather than that, he made the decision to record a voice-over narration to explain the history of the building while he was back at home editing the video. The starting point for this voiceover is precisely when his camera focuses on the dimly lit hallway in the basement. This building was actually a children's asylum that had been closed down and shut down sometime in the 90s, according to Dan, who explains this information in a calm and steady voice. At the beginning of the 21st century, he mentions that the building was rented out to a private tenant for a brief period of time. However, for the most part, the structure had been completely vacant and abandoned for close to 30 years. Decomposition had been allowed to take place, with the damp air and the forest that surrounded it gradually reclaiming it. Dan suddenly pauses after he has finished sharing this brief history, which he does in a tone that is very casual and has been carefully practiced. While he was inside the building on that particular day, he experienced something that he describes as being extremely peculiar and unsettling. He mentions this to his audience. He heard the distinct and unmistakable sound of someone running around on the very top floor of the structure while he was walking through the lower levels of the building. After all, Dan had spent his entire life inside dozens of buildings that had been abandoned. He was very accustomed to the sights and sounds of deserted locations, and he was aware that wild animals, birds, and other stray creatures frequently made their homes within these peaceful ruins. The sound of a bird, a raccoon, or a squirrel moving around was something that was heard quite frequently. Therefore, his obvious and reasonable assumption was that there had to be some kind of animal running across the floorboards in the upper level of the building. It did not appear to be a source of significant concern for him. After making the decision to maintain his composure, he completed the filming of his tour of the first floor and then slowly made his way up the stairs in order to investigate the upper level. When Dan finally made it to the top floor, he anticipated getting a glimpse of some tangible evidence of whatever it was that had been making that noise. Among the things he looked for were animal droppings, dust that had been disturbed on the floor, and a nest that was concealed in one of the rooms. On the other hand, as he moved from one room to the next, he encountered nothing but complete and utter silence. The rooms were completely silent, devoid of any activity, and covered in a thick layer of dust that had not been disturbed. There were no indications of any kind of life whatsoever, and everything appeared to be exactly the same as the rest of the abandoned building. With a sense of contentment that the sound must have been that of a bird that had already departed, Dan completed the recording of the footage he desired, gathered his camera equipment, and then exited the building. After getting into his vehicle and driving home, he did not give the mysterious running sounds much more thought he had been thinking about. His stomach dropped completely when he sat down at his computer, loaded the raw footage from his SD card, and started going through it frame by frame. Only then did he feel a sense of relief. He became aware of the fact that he had not been the only person present in that children's asylum as he watched the video on his enormous monitor. In point of fact, he had been sharing the dark and empty building with another individual who was actively hiding in the shadows and watching his every move. Dan started to conjecture that perhaps a person who had previously been a patient at the asylum or a person who was on the move had taken up residence in one of the hidden rooms located on the upper floor. After taking a closer look at the video, he was able to pinpoint two distinct and unsettling instances in which the phantom figure was captured on camera. In the first video, you will need to pay close attention to a door that is open and that leads directly to the staircase that is located in the basement. During the time that Dan is filming the dark spaces that surround him in the hallway, a distinct shadow is being cast onto the surface of the door. A person who is standing just out of the camera's line of sight, right at the top of the stairs, and looking down at Dan is clearly the source of this shadow. As the shadow is silhouetted against the weathered wood of the door, it remains perfectly still for a number of seconds. At that moment, as Dan pans his camera back down the hallway, the shadow suddenly and silently disappears, indicating that the individual had quietly slipped down the stairs deeper into the darkness of the basement and directly toward where Dan was filming. The second video is even more upsetting than the first. As Dan enters one of the rooms on the upper floor, he starts to move his camera around the room in order to capture the entire area. There is an old wooden door inside the room, and it is located in the back left corner of the space. If you look at the door very carefully, specifically at the small hole that is empty where the doorknob used to be, you will be able to see a human eye looking right through the hole. Dan was being observed by a person who was standing on the opposite side of that door, pressing themselves against the wood and looking through the small opening to observe his movements. The individual on the other side of the door becomes aware that they have been observed the moment the camera focuses its attention directly on the door. There is a sudden and frantic motion that causes the shadow that is behind the hole to shift, and you hear a faint sound of them running away down the corridor on the other side of the hole. There are times when the most dangerous thing in an abandoned building is not the deteriorating structure itself, but rather the living people who continue to haunt the halls of the building. This is a reminder that is deeply haunting. Our next story involves a woman who went to a very familiar and safe place in her community only to run into a nightmare that she would never be able to escape from. While Dan Bell was fortunate enough to walk out of that abandoned asylum completely unharmed, our next story involves a woman who went to a place that she knew it was safe. Missy Beavers was a woman whose life was characterized by vitality, love, and a profound devotion to her family and her community. However, her story would ultimately culminate in one of the most perplexing and unsettling unsolved crimes in recent memory. This is the story of Missy Beavers. The woman who lived in Midlothian, Texas, was known as Missy Beavers, and she was 45 years old. Just to the south of the Dallas-Fort Worth metropolitan area is where you'll find the tranquil and peaceful suburb of Midlothian. The town is the kind of close-knit community in which residents are familiar with one another, children are able to play in the streets without fear of harm, and violent crime is extremely uncommon. Brandon was a devoted husband to Missy, and she was a loving mother to their 3 beautiful daughters. Missy was a devoted wife to Brandon. In addition to that, she was one of the most successful and enthusiastic fitness instructors. The local fitness boot camp that Missy ran was called Camp Gladiator, and it was a high-intensity workout program that she taught first thing in the morning. Missy was the kind of person who lived life to the fullest possible extent. At the same time that she was extremely bubbly, optimistic, and outgoing, she possessed a natural ability to motivate and inspire everyone who was in her immediate vicinity. When it came to social media, where she was an exceptionally active user of Facebook, her lively personality was especially noticeable. Throughout the day, she would post multiple times, sharing updates about her life, including her daily workout routines, her healthy meal routines, and photos of her family vacations. In order to ensure that everyone had the opportunity to participate in her fitness class, Missy made sure to post her personal cell phone number on her public Facebook page. This allowed anyone who was interested in enrolling in her class to get in touch with her via direct message. In addition to the fact that she had nothing to conceal, she was always willing to accept new people into her life. On the evening of Sunday, April 17th, 26, Missy was getting ready for her regular Monday morning boot camp class, which was planning to take place at 5 o'clock the following morning. The class was scheduled to take place the following day. As the evening progressed, however, local weather reports started forecasting severe heavy rainstorms and thunderstorms for the early morning hours of Monday. These forecasts were made for the early morning hours. As a result of the fact that the class was typically held outside, Missy's phone started to ring with calls and text messages from her students. All of them were curious about whether or not the class would be canceled due to the inclement weather this morning. Missy made the decision to address the situation by publishing a public post on her Facebook page at 7:55 that evening. This was due to the fact that a large number of people had reached out to her. She sent a message to her students in which she informed them that even if it was raining, they were still training and that there were no excuses because they were gladiators. She explained that because of the rain, they would be moving the class indoors inside the Creekside Church of Christ, which was situated in Midlothian within a short distance of the main highway. She provided the precise address of the church, the start time of 5 o'clock, as well as instructions on what kinds of equipment she expected attendees to bring. A little later that evening, at 9:23, she made one last post, in which she stated that she was going to bed because she had to get ready for the next day at 3:30 in the morning. Missy's alarm went off at 3:30 the following morning, which was Monday, April 18th. Today is Monday. It was pouring rain when she drove her white pickup truck through the pitch black night toward the Creekside Church of Christ. She got out of bed, put on her workout clothes, and then traveled. An image of her truck pulling into the parking lot of the church was captured by a security camera that was located on the opposite side of the street at 4:16 in the morning. As much as possible, Missy would arrive at her classes early. In order to be enthusiastic and welcoming when her first students walked through the door, she wanted to have plenty of time to carry her equipment inside, set up the classroom, turn on the lights, and do a quick warm-up. She wanted to be ready for them. It was 4:20 in the morning when the security cameras located within the lobby of the church caught Missy walking through the front doors, carrying her belongings, and making her way down the hallway in the direction of the designated classroom. When the first couple of students arrived at the church for the class, it was just before 5 o'clock in the morning. They had just gotten out of their cars and were running into the building as the rain continued to fall heavily. With the expectation that they would find Missy preparing the classroom and playing upbeat music, they made their way through the lobby and then proceeded down the hallway toward the classroom. The reality was that they were confronted with a horrifying scene as soon as they entered the room. Missy was lying on the ground, unresponsive, and heavily bleeding from severe wounds to her head. Her injuries were critical. Students who were taken aback immediately dialed the number 911. Despite the fact that emergency medical technicians and law enforcement officers rushed to the church, as soon as they arrived and examined her, they realized that there was nothing they could do to help her. At the scene, Missy was certified as having passed away. In the beginning, there was some kind of speculation that Missy might have been the victim of a tragic accident. This was due to the fact that the room was dark and the discovery was made so suddenly. It was speculated by the investigators that she had injured her head on the hard concrete floor after falling and tripping over some equipment that was located in the dark. However, after the arrival of the medical examiner and the completion of a more thorough examination, they immediately ruled out the possibility of an accident. A number of deep puncture wounds had been purposefully and violently inflicted on Missy's head and chest. These wounds were present throughout her body. It could not be denied that she had been repeatedly struck by a blunt object that was both heavy and blunt. The building was immediately secured by the police, and they immediately began an exhaustive investigation, beginning with the footage from the private security cameras located within the church. As soon as they watched the video, they were completely and utterly shocked by what they saw. Later that morning, at precisely 3:50, which was 26 minutes before Missy even pulled into the parking lot, the security cameras revealed that an unknown person had broken into the church through a side door. This occurred earlier than Missy had even pulled into the parking lot. Heavy, professional police tactical gear covered this individual from head to toe. They were dressed in full uniform. They wore a dark hood or mask that completely obscured their face, a heavy tactical helmet that was black in color, a heavy ballistic vest that had the word police printed across the front in bold letters, heavy tactical gloves, and shin guards. This masked figure slowly and casually strolled up and down the empty hallways of the church for 30 minutes, beginning at 3:50 in the morning and continuing until Missy walked through the doors at 4:20. A pry bar or a hammer was the heavy instrument that they were carrying in their hand, according to the investigators who were looking into the matter. The killer's remarkably calm and unconcerned demeanor was the major factor that contributed to the footage's profoundly unsettling nature. We did not get the impression that they were anxious, nor did we get the impression that they were in a hurry. As they made their way through the corridors, it was almost as if they were going for a peaceful stroll in a park. Occasionally, as they passed a door leading to a classroom, they would pause, turn their attention to the glass window that was located on the door, and then use their instrument to casually break the glass from the window. Once that was over, they would simply turn around and proceed to walk down the hall as if nothing had really occurred. They did not go into the rooms at any point in order to look for valuables. The individuals in question did not break into the church office with the intention of stealing money, nor did they steal any of the costly electronic equipment or sound systems that were openly displayed in the sanctuary. Upon further investigation, the police were able to confirm that the church had not been the victim of any thefts. The findings of the investigation revealed a significant finding after the investigators analyzed this behavior. Both the act of vandalizing the church and the act of committing a robbery were not the intentions of this individual who was present. As if they were merely attempting to kill time, they were breaking the glass windows, which gave the impression that they were doing so out of sheer boredom. In spite of the fact that they appeared to have a very particular and singular purpose for being present at the church that morning, they were unable to carry out their plan at that time. They were awaiting the activation of a cause. In addition, the moment that Missy Beavers entered the building at precisely 4:20 in the morning was the moment that the trigger was executed. Shortly after Missy entered the building, the murderer became aware of her presence. According to the surveillance footage, the masked individual turned around and moved in the direction of the location where Missy was preparing to act. They followed her into the classroom, surrounded her, and then used the heavy tool to brutally beat her to death that they had discovered. In the time it took for the police to arrive, which was a little after 5 o'clock, the murderer had already escaped the building through a back exit and disappeared into the wet morning. He had not left any physical evidence, fingerprints, or DNA behind. At first, the authorities were under the impression that determining who the murderer was would be a relatively simple task. The security footage captured the individual's physical movements in high definition, despite the fact that the mask and helmet completely concealed the individual's face. The murderer walked in a manner that was incredibly unique and recognizable. A very noticeable swinging waddle was created by them as they walked, because they walked with a very pronounced slouch. Their shoulders were rounded forward and their feet turned significantly outward as they took steps. In addition to this, it appeared as though they walked with a slight limp that remained from side to side. The authorities were confident that this one-of-a-kind physical gait was so easily recognizable that anyone who knew this individual in real life would be able to recognize them without any difficulty. In the hopes of achieving a speedy breakthrough, the police made the decision to make the surveillance footage available to the general public. The video made its way onto national news broadcasts and was widely shared across social media platforms in a short amount of time. Within a matter of hours, the Midlothian Police Department received hundreds of tips from the public. Many individuals from different parts of the country called in to say that they were familiar with the walk. They pointed the finger at people in their immediate vicinity, including family members, co-workers, acquaintances, and neighbors who walked with a limp or an outward turn of their feet. The investigators spent a considerable amount of time following up on each and every one of these leads. The investigation included conducting hundreds of interviews, searching homes, analyzing data from cell phone towers, and verifying alibis. However, the problem was that they thoroughly investigated every single suspect, but in the end, they were unable to identify any of them. At the time of the murder, every single person had a reliable and verifiable alibi that placed them in a location that was relatively far from the church. There have been a lot of different hypotheses proposed over the years regarding the reasons why Missy was targeted. There was a question among some individuals as to whether or not it was a targeted attack, possibly connected to her personal life or someone she had met through her constant presence on social media. Others speculated that the murderer might have misidentified her as someone else, or that it might have been a chance encounter with a deeply troubled person who had made the decision to commit a crime while dressed in tactical gear. On the other hand, the police have never been able to make an arrest because they do not have any tangible evidence. To this day, the mystery surrounding Missy Bevers has not been concluded in any way. Her husband, her 3 daughters, and the community of Midlothian are still left with the agonizing questions of who that masked figure was and why they were waiting in the dark hallways of the church on that rainy morning. These questions have not been answered. While the person responsible for the murder of Missy Bevers continues to remain concealed behind a mask and a cold, unsolved file, our third story transports us to a case in which the perpetrator was not only apprehended, but it was revealed to be an elderly woman whose pleasant and harmless appearance concealed a lifetime of unimaginable horror. Tamara Samsonova is the subject of this narrative. She is a woman who would later become known by a terrifying nickname, and the secrets that she would reveal would shock the entire nation of Russia. In March of the year 2015, our story begins in the stunning and historically significant city of St. Petersburg, which is located in Russia. The life of Tamara Samsonova, a retired woman of 68 years of age, was characterized by a low-key and unassuming existence within her apartment. In the spring of that year, Tamara made the decision to have her house undergo a significant amount of renovation and repair work. She needed to find a place to stay for a few weeks because the construction was going to be noisy, dusty, and make her apartment temporarily unlivable. She needed to find a place to stay. An acquaintance of hers who has known her for a very long time, Valentina Olenova, who is now 79 years old, became aware of Tamara's predicament. A woman who lived alone in a cozy apartment in the neighborhood, Valentina was known for her generosity and kindness. She made contact with Tamara and told her that she would be willing to let her move in with her until the renovations on her apartment were finished in their entirety. Tamara was so moved by the generosity of her friend that she accepted the offer without hesitation. She then proceeded to pack her belongings and move into Valentina's residence. Due to the fact that Tamara was staying in the apartment without paying rent, she wanted to make sure that she was contributing as much as she could in order to demonstrate her love and gratitude. After she moved in, she immediately began taking care of the chores around the house. In addition to washing the windows, sweeping the floors, and doing the dishes, she ensured that the apartment was spotless from top to bottom. Additionally, she made it a point to prepare delectable and hot meals for Valentina on a daily basis, as well as to take care of all the chores in the kitchen and going grocery shopping. The initial arrangement was flawless in every way. At the same time that the two elderly women took pleasure in each other's company, Valentina was relieved to have the additional assistance around the house. For the two of them, it appeared to be a wonderful and peaceful living situation. Nevertheless, after a few weeks had passed, the entirety of the renovations that had been done on Tamara's apartment were finished, and her house was prepared for her to return. But the issue was that Tamara did not wish to depart from the situation. She was beginning to develop a strong affection for living with Valentina, and she took pleasure in the convenience of the apartment as well as the daily routine that they had established together. She made a promise to Valentina that she would not be a burden, and she asked Valentina if she could stay some more time than she had planned. Valentina was a little bit hesitant before agreeing to let Tamara stay for a little while longer because she valued her privacy and her quiet, solitary lifestyle. However, in the end, she agreed to let Tamara stay for a while longer because they were old friends and things had been going so well. As the weeks turned into months, Tamara provided no indication whatsoever that she intended to return to the apartment that she had previously occupied. As time went on, Valentina started to experience feelings of exhaustion, frustration, and annoyance. Tamara was beginning to behave as if she was the permanent owner of the space, despite the fact that her tranquil home was no longer her own. The patience that Valentina had was wearing thin, and she came to the realization that she needed to establish a clear boundary. At last, Valentina confronted Tamara toward the end of the month of July in the year 2015. Tamara was informed in a straightforward and authoritative manner that the renovations had been completed for a considerable amount of time and that it was now the appropriate time for her to gather her belongings and return to her own residence. Tamara, on the other hand, became increasingly defensive and flatly refused to leave rather than comprehending the situation and agreeing to leave. As a result of this refusal, the two women engaged in a heated and yelling argument among themselves. They yelled at each other for hours, releasing the frustration and anger that had been building up over the course of years. Despite the fact that the fight had come to an end, Tamara continued to refuse to pack her bags. Over the course of the subsequent few days, the apartment was filled with a heavy and unsettling silence. The two women did not communicate with one another in any way, did not make eye contact with one another, and did not even bother to be in the same room together. Suffocating tension pervaded the cramped apartment that was so small. On the morning of July 23rd, the silence was finally broken when another argument broke out over dirty cups that were found in the kitchen sink. Within a short period of time, this situation quickly escalated back to Tamara leaving, and she finally agreed to pack her bags within a few days. In order to commemorate the occasion, she agreed to prepare Valentina's preferred salad. Instead of that, she went to a pharmacy, purchased some sleeping pills, and then crushed them up and mixed them into the dressing. Following her consumption of the entire salad, Valentina quickly passed out. Tamara discovered her lying on the ground at 2 o'clock in the morning. She used a borrowed hacksaw to dismember her body while she was still alive, but unconscious. She did this while she was still alive. Due to the fact that she had a weakness for human lungs, she carefully removed Valentina's lungs in order to consume them, and then she boiled her head on the stove. The remaining parts of the body were placed in bags and then dumped in a nearby lake or forest over the course of dozens of distinct trips. After a period of 4 days, a couple who were out walking their dog discovered her body by the lake. The authorities were able to identify Valentina and proceeded to the apartment where they discovered Tamara to be completely uninterested. During their search of the house, they discovered a magic book, blood, and a hacksaw. Additionally, they discovered a diary that detailed 14 ritualistic killings. After Tamara admitted her guilt, she was given a sentence of life in prison. You are very much appreciated for watching. If you watched today's episode, please share your thoughts with me in the comments section. You should also keep in mind that we have an entire playlist of episodes of True Crime ready for you to watch in one sitting right now. Up until the next time. What's up? In the early hours of Saturday, the 19th of October 2013, a 2-3-year-old man named Ode Edgelor stood at a crowded bar in a dance club in Antwerp, Belgium. The air was thick with the beat of the music and the energy of the crowd. The bartender slid 2 shot glasses across the slick surface of the bar, and Ode expertly scooped them up. He turned, a grin on his face, and handed one to his friend, Kevin Rodriguez Fuentes, who was waiting right behind him. It was Kevin's birthday, and the night was all about celebrating. Ode raised his glass high. Over the thumping bass, he shouted, "Happy birthday," in his native Spanish. Kevin grinned back, and together they tilted their heads back and slammed down the shots. The burn of the liquor was just another part of the night's excitement. Ode was relatively new to Antwerp. He had moved from Spain about 6 months earlier for a great job as a computer engineer. It was a big step, moving to a new country where he didn't know a soul. But Ode was outgoing and friendly, and it didn't take him long to start building a new life. He'd met Kevin at a local beer festival not long after he arrived. They hit it off immediately. Kevin was from the area, so he took Ode under his wing, introducing him to his circle of friends and showing him all the best places to go out in the city. They became close, fast. Back in the club, after the shots, Kevin tapped Ode on the shoulder. He pointed towards the middle of the dance floor, a wide smile spreading across his face. A group of young women, about their age, were dancing together. Without another word, the 2 friends made their way through the crowd and onto the dance floor. From that point on, the night dissolved into a happy, energetic blur for Ode. He went back and forth between dancing with their new friends and heading to the bar for more drinks. He was having an amazing time. It was nights exactly like this that were making Antwerp feel less like a foreign city and more like a real home. But as the hours wore on, he could feel the alcohol catching up to him. He knew that if he stayed much longer, he risked passing out right there. Sometime later, Ode, Kevin, and a few of the new friends they'd met stumbled out of the club's doors and into the cool night air. The city streets were quiet and mostly empty. Ode instinctively pulled his phone from his pocket to check the time. His vision was blurry, and he had to squint, but he could make out the numbers on the screen. It was nearly 4 a.m. It was incredibly late, practically the next morning. He knew it was time to call it a night. He said his goodbyes to the group, wished Kevin a final happy birthday, and then turned to begin the walk home. The next morning, Kevin woke up in his bed with a skull-splitting headache. He blinked his eyes open, his room slowly coming into focus. He let out a sigh of relief. He was home, safe. The last part of the night was a complete fog. He honestly couldn't remember how he'd even gotten back to his apartment. He groaned, rolled over, and fumbled for his phone on the nightstand. It was a reflexive move for anyone after a long night out. He sent a group text to Ode and another friend who had been with them, asking the simple question, "How are you feeling?" The other friend replied almost immediately, complaining about his own hangover. But there was no reply from Ode. At first, Kevin didn't think much of it. Ode had been drinking just as much as he had. He was probably still sound asleep, trying to recover. He figured he'd hear from him later in the day. But the day passed, and still nothing. The sun went down, and Kevin's phone remained silent. By the next day, which was Sunday, October 20th, with still no word from Ode, Kevin's casual concern started to turn into real worry. This was unusual. He decided to call Ode directly. He put the phone to his ear, but it didn't ring. It went straight to voicemail. That meant his phone was either dead or turned off. This small detail sent a jolt of anxiety through Kevin. Ode was always good about keeping his phone charged and was usually quick to respond to messages. 24 hours of silence was not like him at all, not even with the worst hangover. Kevin immediately called the other friend from their group. He asked if he'd heard anything from Ode. The friend said no, he hadn't spoken to him since they all left the club. The worry was now escalating into a quiet panic. Kevin decided he needed to go check on him in person. He got dressed and headed over to Ode's apartment. When he arrived, he found Ode's roommates at home, but Ode wasn't there. The roommates didn't know Ode all that well. They were more just people who shared a living space. They told Kevin that O'Day hadn't come home after the birthday party. They just assumed he was crashing at a friend's place for the weekend and hadn't thought anything of it. But for Kevin, this was a huge red flag. O'Day would have told him if he was staying somewhere else. They were close friends. He would have been the first to know. The panic was no longer quiet. As he stood there in O'Day's empty room, his mind raced, trying to think of any possible explanation. Then, a thought struck him. He remembered that one of their mutual friends, a young woman named Owen, had gone out of town for a wedding. Maybe, just maybe, O'Day had made a last-minute decision to go with her. It was a long shot, but it was the only logical explanation he could come up with. He left the apartment and immediately called Owen. He was hoping she would pick up and tell him that O'Day was right there with her, that everything was fine. But when she answered, he could hear the panic in her voice, too. It turned out she had also been trying to reach O'Day for the past day, calling and texting him nonstop with no response. She was just as worried as he was. The reality of the situation crashed down on Kevin. No one had seen or heard from O'Day since he left the group at 4 a.m. to walk home. He was just gone. Kevin felt a wave of helplessness wash over him, but he knew he couldn't just stand there. His friend could be in trouble. He took a deep breath, his hands shaking slightly, and he contacted the police to officially report O'Day Edgelor as a missing person. The following day, Monday, October 21st, Kevin found himself sitting in a small, sterile room at the police station across from two detectives from the Belgian National Police's Missing Persons Unit. As they began to ask him questions, the meeting quickly became frustrating for everyone involved. Kevin tried his best to recount the events of the night, but his memory was a haze of blurry images and fragmented conversations. He had been just as drunk as O'Day. He felt a deep sense of guilt for not being able to provide more details. But he did manage to recall a few crucial things. He remembered exactly what O'Day had been wearing, a gray hooded sweatshirt and a very distinctive black and white checkered scarf. He also knew the specific area of the city where they had been out. But that was about it. When he left the police station, Kevin felt like he had failed his friend. The idea of just going home to sit and wait while the police conducted their search was unbearable. O'Day could be hurt somewhere, needing help. He had to do something more. That afternoon, Kevin met up with Owen and a few of O'Day's other friends. Together, they printed hundreds of posters with O'Day's picture on them. They spent the rest of the day and evening plastering them all over the city on telephone poles, in shop windows, at bus stops. Antwerp was a bustling city, with bars and restaurants open late into the night. Surely someone must have seen a young man in a black and white checkered scarf walking home. People don't just vanish into thin air. Meanwhile, the detectives got to work. Kevin hadn't given them much, but what he did provide was a starting point. Knowing the general location and what O'Day was wearing turned out to be incredibly useful. Police began the methodical process of collecting CCTV surveillance footage from businesses and street cameras in the area where O'Day was last seen. They painstakingly reviewed hours and hours of footage, looking for a glimpse of that gray hoodie and checkered scarf. It didn't take them long to find him. On one camera, they saw O'Day walking alone down a dimly lit side street just as Kevin had described. His distinctive scarf stood out clearly, even on the grainy nighttime footage. The investigators were hoping the footage would show him getting into a taxi, or meeting up with someone, or even just going into a building. But what they saw next made them lean in closer to the monitor. Out of the deep shadows of a doorway, a figure suddenly emerged. The man rushed towards O'Day. It was an ambush. The man attacked O'Day, and in the brief struggle, he snatched what looked like O'Day's wallet from his pocket. Then, just as quickly as he appeared, the attacker took off running, disappearing down the street. The investigators weren't entirely surprised. While Antwerp was a relatively safe city, muggings did happen, especially to people who were visibly intoxicated and walking home alone late at night. It was a disturbing piece of evidence, but it was also a solid lead. But their investigation was about to take a truly bizarre turn. They continued to track O'Day's path through the city's network of cameras. On footage from a different camera, just a few minutes after the first mugging, they saw O'Day again. He had clearly pulled himself together and was still trying to make his way home. He was still walking alone. But then, it happened again. Suddenly, 2 new men appeared and rushed him. They attacked him, and this time, they took his phone. Then, like the first mugger, they sprinted off into the darkness, leaving O'Day alone on the street once again. The detectives in the room stared at the screen in disbelief. In the span of just a few minutes, O'Day had been mugged twice by 3 different people. None of them had ever seen anything like it. It felt like a scene from a movie, something so unlucky it was almost unbelievable. Now, they had a new set of questions. Were these 3 attackers working together? Was it some kind of coordinated attack? Or was it just a case of extraordinarily bad luck? They didn't know, but they now had a clear objective. The muggers had stolen O'Day's wallet and his cell phone. That meant they could track the credit cards and the phone's data. They hoped this digital trail would lead them directly to the attackers. Once they had the muggers in custody, they believed they would get the answers they needed to find O'Day. The investigators' plan took a few days to execute, but it worked perfectly. They tracked O'Day's stolen credit card and discovered that someone had tried to use it at an ATM in the city. They immediately pulled the surveillance footage from that ATM and got a clear picture of the first mugger. Then, using cell phone tower data, they were able to trace the path of O'Day's stolen phone. By cross-referencing that data with CCTV footage along the route, they managed to identify the other 2 attackers from the second mugging. They now had all 3 men. They were confident that the mystery of O'Day's disappearance was about to be solved. Fast forward to October 29th. It had been 10 long days since O'Day had vanished, and there was still no sign of him. The police brought the 3 muggers in for questioning, interviewing each of them separately. The detectives laid it all out on the table. They told them they had a mountain of evidence: CCTV footage, ATM photos, cell phone data. They knew they were the ones who had robbed O'Day moments before he disappeared. There was no point in denying it. And to their surprise, none of the men did. All 3 of them freely admitted to robbing O'Day. They told the police exactly what they had stolen. But they all insisted on 2 things. First, their attacks were not coordinated in any way. It was a complete coincidence that they had both targeted the same person within minutes of each other. And second, and more importantly, they all swore that they had absolutely nothing to do with his disappearance. They said they just robbed him and ran. That was it. The investigators listened to their stories with deep skepticism. The idea that 3 criminals had randomly and separately mugged the same man, who then coincidentally vanished in a third unrelated incident, seemed almost laughably improbable. It defied all logic. They pressed the men hard, convinced they were lying, convinced they were hiding a much darker secret. But no matter how much pressure they applied, their stories never changed. We mugged him, we ran away, and we never saw him again. The police arrested and held all 3 men on robbery charges. But their primary goal was still to connect them to O'Day's disappearance. They were sure that with enough time, one of them would crack and tell the truth about what really happened to him. But then, another piece of surveillance footage surfaced from a camera further down the street. And this new footage changed everything. It showed O'Day just moments after the second mugging had occurred. And just as the muggers had claimed, the video showed them running away in the opposite direction. More importantly, it showed O'Day alone, dusting himself off for a second time, and then continuing to walk down the street, eventually moving out of the camera's frame. He was alone. To their absolute astonishment, the police had to accept that the muggers might have been telling the truth all along. This meant that after being violently robbed twice, O'Day had simply kept walking through the streets of Antwerp. Their best and only lead had just evaporated. The investigation was back at square one. This new footage also meant that the search area was now much, much larger. They had to search the entire city. In early November 2013, about 2 weeks after O'Day vanished, The Belgian National Police launched a massive search operation across Antwerp. They went back to every bar, club, and restaurant in the area where O'Day had been. They re-interviewed staff and patrons, showing O'Day's picture, asking if anyone remembered seeing him. But everywhere they went, they hit a dead end. No one knew anything. As the days turned into weeks, the focus of the search slowly shifted northward, following the general direction O'Day had been walking when he was last seen on camera. This path was leading them away from the city center and towards the banks of the River Scheldt, a wide, dark river that cuts through Antwerp on its way to the North Sea. On the evening of November 7th, 19 days after O'Day was last seen, a few detectives found themselves standing on the deck of a very unique structure floating on the River Scheldt. It was called the Boat. Earlier that day, police boats had been dragging the riverbed while search dogs patrolled the banks, looking for any sign of O'Day. A visit to the Boat was a necessary part of this river search. The Boat was a massive entertainment venue, a club, a bar, and a high-end restaurant, all built onto a converted ship that was permanently moored in the river. But its main attraction, the thing that drew crowds from all over, was an almost Olympic-sized swimming pool built right into the deck. It gave the incredible illusion of a pool floating on the surface of the river. It was known as the world's largest floating swimming pool, and it was always busy. The detectives hoped that because of the boat's excellent, unobstructed view of the river and the surrounding banks, someone there might have seen something on the morning O'Day went missing. They split up and began interviewing the staff and patrons, asking the same question they'd asked hundreds of times. Did you see a young man wearing a black and white checkered scarf? By now, nearly everyone in the city knew about O'Day's case. His face was on posters everywhere. People were eager to help, trying to recall any small detail that might be useful. But despite their best intentions, no one on the boat had any meaningful information. The investigators left empty-handed and spent the rest of the day watching the fruitless search of the river. On the 19th of November 2013, 1 full month after O'Day's disappearance, his friends and family held public gatherings in both Antwerp and his hometown in the Basque Country of Spain. His family in Spain made it clear this was not a memorial. They were holding on to the hope that O'Day was still alive somewhere. The gathering was a show of love and an effort to keep his story in the public eye. In Antwerp, his friends tried to send the same message of hope. But as 2013 came to a close, that hope was beginning to fade. The police investigation had stalled completely. The 3 muggers were still in custody, but they hadn't changed their stories. The citywide canvass had yielded nothing. O'Day's friends and family began to fear the worst, that the police, with no new leads to follow, would simply give up. But then, in the early summer of 2014, something incredible happened. More than 7 months after he disappeared, O'Day's story suddenly went viral. It spread far beyond Belgium and Spain, capturing the attention of people all across Europe. This was highly unusual. Thousands of people go missing every year, and most cases barely make the local news. But there was something about O'Day's story, the young engineer starting a new life, the unbelievable double mugging, the complete mystery of his vanishing that resonated deeply with people. It felt impossibly tragic. Just as it seemed the official investigation was winding down, a massive public outcry demanded the opposite. People from all over the continent called for the Belgian police. The international support was overwhelming. Poets wrote poems about O'Day. Musicians wrote songs for him. Charity groups organized their own volunteer searches in Belgium. It was as if the world was rallying together with a single voice. Find O'Day. The tipping point came in October 2014, as the first anniversary of his disappearance approached. One of the most famous soccer players in the world, Cristiano Ronaldo, played a match wearing a jersey with images of O'Day on it. The message reached millions. The pressure on the Belgian government became immense, and they responded. The Belgian National Police officially redoubled their efforts, expanding the search to the entire country. They even enlisted the help of Interpol to extend the search into other European nations. Throughout 2014 and into 2015, investigators revisited every lead, re-interviewed every witness, and made regular public announcements to show they were still actively searching. But despite this monumental effort, they found nothing. O'Day was still gone. Then, on the 18th of September 2015, nearly 2 years after O'Day's disappearance, a strange incident involving the boat would ultimately lead to the answer. The boat itself was essentially a large, flat, floating platform, more like a huge dock than a traditional ship with a deep hull. On that day, the massive swimming pool on its deck started to leak. Because the pool was recessed into the deck, its bottom was submerged just below the surface of the river. A breach in the pool's base caused it to take on water from the river, and the immense weight of it all became too much. The entire swimming pool structure broke away from the main boat and sank to the bottom of the river Scheldt. Luckily, no one was hurt, but the story made local headlines. The boat was a major city attraction. The city quickly began making plans to salvage the sunken pool. On the 11th of February 2016, almost 2.5 years after O'Day vanished, the recovery operation began. 2 massive cranes mounted on a barge were brought in. Cables were lowered and attached to the sunken pool. A member of the work crew stood on the barge, watching intently as the cranes slowly, carefully began to lift their heavy load from the riverbed. The water churned as the massive structure was raised. Soon, the top edge of the swimming pool broke the surface. A few workers let out a small cheer. But the crew member on the barge saw something else. Something in the water, caught on the rising structure. At first, he couldn't make it out. He leaned over the side for a better look. His eyes widened in horror. He immediately shouted for the crane operator to stop. The whining of the cranes fell silent. With a shaking hand, the crew member pulled out his phone and dialed the police. After a thorough forensic investigation, the police were finally able to piece together what happened to O'Day Edgelor on that tragic night. At around 4 a.m., on the 19th of October 2013, after leaving his friends, O'Day started his walk home. He was mugged twice in rapid succession. After the second attack, he was hurt, scared, and extremely disoriented from the alcohol and the trauma. He tried to continue on his way, but he was lost. Sometime later, he encountered a group of strangers who saw his condition beat up and confused and tried to help him. They offered to call him a taxi, but O'Day was so disoriented he didn't even seem to understand them. He just wandered off into the night. By this point, he had walked far off course, ending up near the banks of the river Scheldt, nowhere near his home. At some point, in his drunken and confused state, he got too close to the river's edge. He stumbled, lost his footing, and fell into the cold, dark water. The shock of the icy water may have sobered him slightly, but he was too intoxicated to fight the strong current effectively. The river pulled him along, eventually sweeping him up against the side of the boat. He was trapped there, pinned against the hull by the current, right next to the recessed swimming pool. He was exhausted and too weak to swim away. He struggled to keep his head above water, but eventually, he had no energy left. The current pulled him under the surface and forced him into the small space between the bottom of the swimming pool and the riverbed. He became wedged there, and he drowned. For more than 2 years, O'Day's body remained trapped beneath that swimming pool. Thousands of people swam and partied just a few feet above him, completely unaware. It was only when the pool sank and was later raised by the cranes that his body was finally discovered, still entangled with the structure that had hidden him for so long. The 3 men who mugged O'Day were ultimately convicted of robbery and each served about 4 years in prison. They were never directly linked to his death. While the authorities concluded that the most likely scenario was a tragic accident where O'Day simply fell into the river, they were never able to officially rule out the possibility of foul play. To this day, O'Day's parents have called for the investigation to be reopened, still searching for definitive answers and closure for the loss of their son. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments. And remember, we have a whole playlist of true crime episodes ready for you to binge right now. Until next time, see ya. It was just after midnight, around 12:30 inches the morning on the 9th of August, 2013. A man named Kyle Lawson was fast asleep in his bed next to his wife at their home in San Angelo, Texas. The house was quiet, the night was still, and then suddenly, the distinct sound of a cell phone ringing cut through the silence. It was Kyle's phone. He groggily reached over, his eyes still half closed, and looked at the screen. The caller ID showed it was his younger brother, 6-year-old Brandon. Kyle figured it must be important to be calling this late, so he answered it. But before he could even get a hello out, Brandon's voice came through the phone, frantic and panicked. He told Kyle he needed help, right now. And then, he launched into a story that sounded completely wild. Brandon said he was driving his truck north on Highway 277. Now, this isn't some busy interstate. Highway 277 is a desolate, two-lane country road that cuts right through the vast, empty landscape of West Texas. There's not much out there. Brandon told Kyle that as he was driving, he was being chased by 3 men. He didn't say who they were, just that they were after him. And to make matters worse, his truck was on its last legs. He was about to run out of gas any second. So, what he needed Kyle to do was to grab a gas can, drive out to the highway in the middle of the night, find him, and secretly hand off the gas so he could make his escape. As Kyle listened to all this, you might think he'd be terrified for his brother. But he wasn't. In fact, his main feeling was just pure annoyance. He wasn't concerned about 3 mysterious men chasing his brother, because he was almost certain those men didn't exist. He was sure his brother Brandon was just high again, and he was hallucinating. You see, Brandon had a history with methamphetamine. He'd been doing really well for the last 6 months, he'd been clean, he was working hard at being a better partner to his fiancée, a woman named Ledessa, and a better father to their 4 kids. But Kyle knew something had recently changed. Just 2 days before this late-night phone call, Brandon had called him for a very different reason. He had asked Kyle if he knew where he could get some drugs. Kyle, of course, didn't give him any information. Instead, he tried to talk him out of it. He told Brandon, "Don't do it, man. You're doing so good. You're clean. Don't throw it all away." But Kyle had a sinking feeling that his words didn't make a difference. And based on this new crazy phone call, he was pretty sure Brandon had found what he was looking for anyway. The story about the 3 men, the frantic chase, it all sounded like a classic drug-induced paranoia episode. In fact, Kyle already knew why Brandon was even out on that highway in the first place. He had talked to his parents earlier, and they told him that Brandon had gotten into a huge fight with Ledessa. The plan was for Brandon to drive over to their parents' house to cool off for a while. He was essentially in a timeout for his behavior. So the fact that he was now calling with a story about a high-speed chase just cemented Kyle's belief that his brother had relapsed and was completely spun out. Kyle knew from experience that trying to reason with Brandon in this state was pointless. If he told him, "Brandon, there's no one chasing you, you're just high," it would just make things worse. Brandon wouldn't believe him. So, instead of arguing, Kyle tried to just calm him down. He tried to speak in a soothing voice, tried to get him to focus, but it wasn't working. Brandon just got more and more agitated on the other end of the line. He kept talking about the 3 men, how they were gaining on him, how he was in serious trouble. Finally, Kyle just had to ask. He said, "Dude, Brandon, have you relapsed? Is that what's going on here?" As expected, Brandon immediately denied it. He swore up and down that he was not high, that this was real. And he just kept begging, "Please, Kyle, you have to come help me. Bring the gas. They're going to catch me. You have to hurry." Kyle felt a wave of frustration. Part of him just wanted to hang up the phone, roll over, and go back to sleep. This was his brother's mess, not his. He had his own family, his own responsibilities. He shouldn't have to be babysitting his younger brother in the middle of the night. But at the same time, despite the resentment, Kyle loved his brother. And even though he truly believed there was no real danger from some imaginary men, He was worried about what Brandon might do to himself in this state. So, with a heavy sigh, he made a decision. He was going to go out there. He was going to drive down Highway 277, find Brandon, and just get him home safely. He told Brandon he was on his way and then hung up the phone. About 45 minutes later, Kyle was driving his car north on that same dark highway. His wife was in the passenger seat, and their 4-year-old son was asleep in his car seat in the back. His wife hadn't wanted him to go out alone to deal with his brother, so she insisted they all go together. As Kyle drove, he scanned the dark road ahead. Like I said, this area is incredibly desolate. It's just wide open plains on either side of the road with some low shrubs and a few small trees scattered about. Even at night, you can see for a long, long way. There are no buildings, no city lights, nothing to block your view. He was looking for Brandon's truck, but he didn't see anything. There were no other headlights, no taillights, no vehicles at all. The road was completely empty. But he kept driving, peering out into the darkness, even checking the fields on the side of the road, just in case Brandon had swerved off and gotten stuck somewhere. That seemed like a real possibility given his state of mind. And then, finally, after driving for a while, he saw it. Up ahead in the distance, a truck was parked on the shoulder, half on the road and half off. All its lights were off. It wasn't even idling. The engine was clearly shut down. As Kyle got closer, he recognized it. It was Brandon's truck. He had found him. Kyle pulled his own car over to the opposite side of the road and parked. He turned to his wife and told her and their son to stay in the car. He was going to go talk to Brandon, who he assumed was sitting in his truck, waiting. In Kyle's mind, the scene was playing out exactly as he'd expected. There were no other cars, no sign of the 3 men. Just his brother, sitting alone in his truck, probably high as a kite. He figured he'd have a firm talk with him, get him to go home, and they could put this whole crazy night behind them. But when Kyle walked across the road and got to the truck, he looked inside. And there was no one there. Brandon was gone. This didn't make any sense to Kyle. As he had been driving out to meet him, Brandon had been calling him over and over again. Every few minutes, his phone would ring, and it would be Brandon, saying things like, "Hurry up, you've got to get here. They're getting closer. Bring the gasoline." He had been desperate for Kyle to arrive. And now that Kyle was finally here, standing right next to his brother's truck, Brandon was nowhere to be found. He hadn't said anything on the phone about getting out of the truck or hiding. So where was he? What was going on? Kyle started looking around the vehicle, even checking underneath it, feeling more and more confused. And just then, his phone rang again. It was Brandon. Kyle, now completely fed up, answered the phone. "Brandon, where are you?" he said, his voice sharp with irritation. And Brandon's voice came back. "Bro, I'm right here." Kyle looked around wildly. "No, you're not," he said. "I'm looking right at your truck. You're not here. There's no one here." But just as he said that, Kyle saw a pair of headlights approaching in the distance. A car was coming towards them down the highway. As it got closer, he could see the light bar on the roof. It was a police car. The officer was clearly slowing down, obviously planning to stop and see what was going on. And as this cop car was pulling up, Brandon's voice on the phone said something that sent a chill down Kyle's spine. He said, "Run away from that cop. Think about what that means." For Brandon to say that, he had to be watching the scene unfold. He had to be somewhere nearby, close enough to see Kyle, the truck, and the approaching police car. But where? Kyle scanned the open fields on both sides of the road again. It was basically a barren wasteland. There was nowhere to hide. There were a few scattered shrubs and some very small trees way off in the distance, but nothing close by that could conceal a grown man. So where was he? Kyle was now furious and totally bewildered. What kind of game was Brandon playing? He knew exactly why Brandon wanted him to run from the police. Brandon had an active warrant out for his arrest on a drug charge. He was trying to protect himself, telling Kyle not to get the police involved. But Kyle was already involved. He was out here, in the middle of the night, with his wife and child, dealing with this nonsense. He was so incredibly annoyed, he was about to yell into the phone to demand that Brandon show himself, but before he could say another word, Brandon hung up. By now, the police officer had pulled over and parked. He got out of his car and walked over to Kyle, who was still standing by his brother's truck. The officer introduced himself as Deputy Neal from the Coke County Sheriff's Department. He explained that he was responding to a 911 call from a trucker who had reported a stranded vehicle on the side of the road. He pointed to Brandon's truck and asked Kyle if it was his. Kyle knew he couldn't tell the truth. As much as he wanted to just unload everything on the deputy that his brother was probably high on meth, hiding somewhere in the fields, and had a warrant out for his arrest, he couldn't do it. He had to protect his brother. So he told a different story. He said, "No, that's my brother's truck." He called me and said he ran out of gas. I think he must have started walking to go find some. He then asked the deputy if it would be okay if he and his family just drove a little farther down the road to look for Brandon. He said he was sure he was fine, but he wanted to find him and give him a ride. Surprisingly, Deputy Neal agreed. He told him that was fine. So Kyle walked back to his car, got in with his wife and son, and started driving farther down the highway away from the scene. As he drove, he kept looking in his rearview mirror. He could see Deputy Neal still parked next to Brandon's empty truck. Once he was far enough down the road that he knew the deputy couldn't see him anymore, Kyle pulled over again. He immediately started calling his brother's phone over and over and over, trying to get him to pick up. But there was no answer. At this point, Kyle had no idea what to do. His brother was out of contact, hiding somewhere in the dark, and he was stuck on the side of a highway with his tired family. They sat there for a while longer, Kyle periodically trying to call Brandon, but every call went straight to voicemail. Eventually, his 4-year-old son started crying in the back seat. It was now almost 0 inches the morning. He was tired, his wife was tired, and Kyle was just completely over it. He thought to himself, you know what? Brandon is an adult. I tried to help him. I came all the way out here. If he wants to hide in a ditch and not answer his phone, that's his choice. I'm taking my family home. And so that's exactly what he did. He turned the car around and drove back the way he came. As he passed his brother's truck, he saw it was still there. And Deputy Neal was still standing beside it, presumably waiting for the owner to return. Kyle just drove right on by, went home, and they all went to bed. He figured he'd hear from Brandon in the morning with some crazy story to explain everything. He just hoped it would be the end of it. Not long after Kyle drove off, Deputy Neal decided he couldn't just wait there all night. He had done a quick search of Brandon's truck. There was nothing alarming inside. But he did notice that the things a person would normally take with them if they were walking to get gas, like a wallet, keys, or a cell phone, were all missing. This seemed to support the story that Brandon had left on foot. It seemed like a simple case of a guy running out of fuel. So Neal figured he had other calls to get to. It didn't seem like an emergency. He reached into Brandon's truck, turned on the hazard lights so other drivers could see it, then he locked all the doors, got back in his own patrol car, and left. The next morning, around 8 a.m., Deputy Neal drove back out to Highway 277 just to check if Brandon had come back for his truck. But he hadn't. The truck was still sitting there, right where he'd left it, its hazard lights still blinking. Now, Deputy Neal started to feel a bit concerned. It was one thing for the truck to be there for a few hours, but for it to still be there the next morning was strange. Even if Brandon was just walking to get gas, he should have been back by now. All sorts of scenarios started running through his head. Maybe he got hit by a car while walking in the dark. Maybe he got lost wandering in the fields. Or maybe he just decided to abandon the truck and went home some other way. Whatever the case, Neal felt he needed to follow up and make sure Brandon was actually okay. He drove back to the sheriff's department to look up Brandon's contact information. But as soon as he walked in the door, another employee stopped him. They told him that while he was out, the department had received a call from Brandon's fiancée, Ledessa, and the story she told was very different from the one Kyle had given him the night before. According to Ledessa, she and Brandon had been fighting for the past couple of days. On the night he disappeared, he was supposed to be driving to his parents' house to cool off. But he never made it there. And he never came back home to her either. No one had seen or heard from him since he left. Everyone had been calling and texting him, but he wasn't responding. Brandon was officially missing. After hearing this, Deputy Neal was both surprised and pretty angry. It was clear now that Brandon's brother Kyle had been holding back the night before. He had acted like everything was fine, but that was obviously a lie. So the first thing Neal did was go and speak to Kyle and the rest of Brandon's family to get the full story. And it didn't take long for him to realize that they weren't trying to hide some dark secret. They were just trying to protect Brandon, and they honestly didn't realize how serious the situation had become. Now that they knew he was truly missing, they were terrified. They told Neal everything they knew about the drug use, the fight, the paranoid phone call. They begged him to go find him. And that's what Neal did. For the next 4 days, a huge search operation was launched. The search was centered around the spot on Highway 277 where Brandon's truck had been found. They had search teams on foot, canine units, and even helicopters scouring the area. Some of the equipment even had thermal cameras, which could detect body heat from the air. They covered a massive area of that flat, open Texas landscape, but they found absolutely nothing. No sign of Brandon. No footprints, no discarded items, nothing. They also interviewed all the people who owned property in the surrounding area, asking if they had seen a man walking around, or perhaps the 3 men Brandon claimed were chasing him. But no one had seen anything out of the ordinary. It was as if Brandon had just vanished into thin air. After 4 days of finding absolutely no clues, the authorities came to a conclusion. They believed that given Brandon's fight with his fiancée, his active arrest warrant, and the complete lack of any evidence of foul play, he must have fled. They decided he was not in the area because he didn't want to be found. They believed he had run away to start a new life, and searching for him out here was a waste of time. So, they called off the search. It seemed like a pretty open and shut case of a man voluntarily disappearing. That is, until Ledessa came into the station with a piece of information that would change everything. On the 13th of August, 2013, 4 days after Brandon went subjing, right as the official search was being shut down, Ledessa walked into the Coke County Sheriff's Department. An officer sat down with her, and he could see she was extremely distraught. She told him that she had been so worried she had started digging through their shared cell phone records, looking for any clue she could find. And she found something. She pulled a piece of paper from her purse and handed it to the officer. It was a printed copy of Brandon's call log from the night he disappeared. She pointed to one specific entry. It showed that at 12:50 a.m., in between all the frantic calls he had made to his brother Kyle, Brandon had placed another call. He had called 911. Ledessa told the officer that this terrified her. She explained that Brandon was deeply afraid of the police. He would do anything to avoid them, especially with that active warrant hanging over his head. She knew he had even told his own brother to run from Deputy Neal that night. The only reason, she insisted, that Brandon would ever willingly call 911 is if he believed he was in truly grave, immediate danger. But then, she asked, why would he call for help and then seemingly run away from that help when it arrived? It made no sense at all. This was a complete bombshell for the sheriff's department. Up until that moment, they had believed the 911 call that night came from a passing trucker reporting a stranded vehicle. That was the call that sent Deputy Neal to the scene. No one had any idea that Brandon himself had also called 911. The local 911 dispatch center was small, underfunded, and often overwhelmed. It appeared that in the confusion of that night, Brandon's call had simply slipped through the cracks and was never properly communicated to the responding officers. They had never known about it. But now that they did, they needed to hear that call. They immediately contacted the dispatch center and requested the audio recording. When they got it and played it in the office, they were stunned. First, Brandon's voice on the recording was not the voice of someone who had simply run out of gas. He sounded like he was in absolute terror. He genuinely believed his life was on the line. And second, if you listened very, very closely to the recording, you could hear what sounded like another person's voice in the background on Brandon's end of the line just before the call suddenly cut off. The call went like this. The dispatcher answered, 911 emergency. Brandon's voice, breathless and panicked, said, "Yes, I'm in the middle of a field." A stater just pushed guys over right here going toward Abilene on both sides. The dispatcher, clearly confused, said, "Okay, now run that by me one more time." Brandon replied, but his words were jumbled and hard to understand. It sounded like he said, "We're not talking to him. I accidentally ran into him." The dispatcher, trying to clarify, said, "Ah, you ran into him." Okay. Then Brandon said something chilling. "Got the first guy." The dispatcher then asked, "Do you need an ambulance?" Brandon quickly replied, "Yeah, no, I need the cops." The dispatcher then asked, "Okay, is anybody hurt?" But all that came back was silence. The dispatcher called out, "Hello? Hello? Hello?" But the line was dead. Suddenly, the entire case looked different. This wasn't just a guy with a drug problem running away from his life. This sounded like a possible abduction or even a murder. They didn't have a body, but that 911 call gave a terrifying amount of credibility to Brandon's story about being chased. That other voice, his talk of being in a field, of needing the cops, it all pointed to something violent. The search that had just been called off was immediately resumed, but this time it was bigger, more intense, and more desperate. For the next full year, law enforcement and volunteers poured enormous resources into finding Brandon Lawson. But they found nothing. Not a single trace. He was just gone. The area around Highway 277 was searched and researched, but it yielded no clues. Eventually, with no leads to follow, Brandon's case went cold. The authorities may have moved on, but his family never did. LaDessa hired 2 different private detectives over the years. Both of them conducted their own extensive searches, not just around the highway, but all across the state, following up on any potential sightings or tips. But they too came up with nothing. As the years went by, the story of Brandon's disappearance began to spread. It was featured on television shows and podcasts, and it captured the public's imagination. People came up with all sorts of theories. Maybe Brandon really was just hallucinating, wandered off into the vast Texas wilderness, and fell victim to the elements or wild animals. Or maybe his story was true. Maybe those 3 men were real, and they caught up to him that night and did something terrible. Perhaps that other voice on the 911 call belonged to one of his attackers. Or maybe, just maybe, the original police theory was right, and he had successfully fled the area and started a new life under a new name. For 9 long years, there were only questions. And then, in January of 2022, a small group of independent searchers went back out to that same stretch of Highway 277. In a field that had been searched hundreds of times before, they made a discovery that would finally break the case wide open. This small team of volunteers was methodically combing through a field right off the side of the highway, not far from where Brandon's truck had been abandoned. Again, this was an area that had been searched by professionals, by dogs, by helicopters, by hundreds of people over the years. But on this day, as they were walking through the low grass and brush, they saw something. It was an old, tattered pair of shorts, and nearby they found pieces of 2 white sneakers. They knew immediately this could be significant, so they called the sheriff's department. Deputies arrived quickly, secured the area, and began their own careful search. And not far from where the clothes were found, they discovered something else. It was a fragment of a human skull. The remains were sent off for DNA testing, and soon the results came back. The skull fragment belonged to Brandon Lawson. You would think that finding his remains would finally provide some answers, some closure for his family. But in a strange way, it only made the mystery deeper and more baffling. The location where his remains were found was the biggest problem. It was right there, near his truck, in the very heart of the original search area. An area that had been meticulously combed time and time again. Remember, this isn't a dense forest. It's a flat, open field in West Texas. There's nothing but grass, short cactus plants, and a few scattered trees. It's an easy place to search. It seems almost impossible that hundreds of trained searchers with dogs and thermal imaging could have missed a body, or even just skeletal remains, in such an open space. And yet, for 9 years, that's exactly what happened. His skull fragment, his shorts, and his shoes were just not found. It defied all logic. So, this leaves us with two profoundly unsettling possibilities. The first option is that every single search effort over the course of nearly a decade was a failure. That despite the massive manpower, the K-9 units, the helicopters with thermal cameras, and the hundreds of volunteers who walked that ground, they all simply missed him. They all somehow overlooked the body of a grown man who was wearing bright white shoes, lying in a relatively barren field where you can see for miles. That is option one. The second option is that he wasn't there to be found. That during all of those searches, Brandon's body was somewhere else entirely. But if you accept that possibility, it raises even more questions. Where was he? If he was killed, where did it happen? And most disturbing of all, if he was somewhere else, how did a piece of his skull and his clothing end up back in that field right at the center of the search area 9 years later? Was it a coincidence that a small group of volunteers just happened to find it? Or were his remains placed there recently, deliberately, for someone to find? And if so, who would do that and why? We may finally know where Brandon Lawson's journey ended, but the question of how he got there and who was with him in his final moments remains a haunting mystery, lost somewhere out on that long, dark Texas highway. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments. And remember, we have a whole playlist of true crime episodes ready for you to binge right now. Until next time. See ya! Sometimes, the choices we make and the secrets we keep can completely alter the course of human lives. In some cases, these choices are driven by a deep, aching desire to heal a broken past and find a way to make things right. In other cases, they are driven by greed, power, and a shocking level of corruption that completely blinds a person to the value of human life. And in the most tragic cases, they are driven by a quiet, toxic malice that operates completely outside the boundaries of the law, leaving behind a devastation that can never truly be repaired. Today, we are going to look at 3 incredible stories that show just how unpredictable and sometimes how utterly terrifying the human experience can be. We begin in the summer of 2007. A 60-year-old man named Michael Dick was living a very quiet, comfortable life in Bow, which is located in East London. Michael was a semi-retired carpenter, and if you were to look at his day-to-day routine, it was pretty normal. He spent most of his time helping out around the house, visiting with his close friends, and being with his family. He was well liked in his neighborhood, which was a peaceful, safe place to live. But even though his life seemed complete on the surface, Michael was harboring a deep, quiet sadness that had been growing inside of him for a very long time. 10 years earlier, back in 1997, Michael had gone through a very messy, painful divorce with his first wife. At the time of the split, they had a daughter together named Lisa, who was 21 years old. When the divorce was finalized, Michael decided he needed a fresh start to escape the bitterness of the separation. He packed up his things and moved about an hour and a half south down to Bow in East London. But his ex-wife and his daughter, Lisa, stayed behind in the family home, which was located in a quiet, historic town called Sudbury in the county of Suffolk, England. Because the divorce had been so hostile and bitter, the communication between Michael and his old family completely broke down. There were no phone calls, no letters, and no updates. As the weeks turned into months and the months turned into years, Michael completely lost touch with his daughter Lisa. He did not know what she was doing with her life, whether she went to university, if she got married, or if she was even happy. It was like she had vanished from his world entirely. Fast forward 10 years to 2007. Michael is sitting in his home, and suddenly he is hit with this overwhelming, crushing wave of grief. He realized that a whole decade had passed, and he had missed out on his first daughter's entire young adulthood. The guilt of letting those 10 years slip away became absolutely too much for him to bear. He could not stop thinking about her. So he sat down with his current wife and his two younger daughters, and he told them that he had to go find Lisa. He needed to apologize for the lost time, and he wanted to rebuild a relationship with her if she would let him. His family was incredibly supportive. They told him he absolutely had to do it and that they would help him in any way they could. But the problem was, Michael had absolutely no idea where Lisa was. He did not have her phone number, he did not have an email address, and he had no way of contacting his ex-wife to ask for help because they had cut all ties. The only piece of information he had was the physical address of the brick house they had lived in 10 years ago in Sudbury. And so, in August of 2007, Michael decided that this old house was going to be his starting point. He got into the car with his two younger daughters, and they made the 90-minute drive north to Sudbury. When they arrived, Michael navigated through the familiar streets until he found his old neighborhood. It was a beautiful, quiet street lined with classic brick houses on both sides. He slowly drove down the road, his hands gripping the steering wheel tightly, until he spotted his old family home. He pulled the car over, parked right out front, and just sat there for a moment, staring at the front door. His heart was pounding with a mix of hope and sheer anxiety. He stepped out of the car alone, walked up the stone path, took a deep breath, and knocked on the door. After a few moments, the door opened. But the person standing there was not his ex-wife, and it was not Lisa. It was a completely different family who had moved in years after Michael left. Michael politely explained who he was and who he was looking for, but the new owners told him that they had bought the house from someone else and had no idea where the previous occupants had moved. They wished him the best of luck, but they had absolutely no information to give him. Michael thanked them, walked slowly back to his car, and sat in the driver's seat, feeling completely crushed. He looked at his daughters and told them that the trail was completely cold and he did not know what to do next. But his daughters refused to let him give up. They suggested that they just drive around Sudbury for a while. Maybe they would get incredibly lucky and spot Lisa walking down the street, or maybe just seeing the town would spark an idea. So they spent the next couple of hours just aimlessly driving around the streets of Sudbury, looking out the windows and talking about what they should do next. As they drove, they came to the realization that their best bet at finding Lisa was to get some sort of story in the local newspaper. They hoped that if they could get an article published, Lisa, or perhaps someone who knew her, would see it and contact Michael. So they drove to the headquarters of the local paper, the Suffolk Free Press, and went inside. They managed to speak to a reporter and explained Michael's situation. The reporter thought it was a very touching, interesting human interest story and agreed to write a small feature about Michael's search. The reporter, along with a photographer, brought Michael and his two younger daughters outside onto the street. The photographer had them stand together, and he took a picture of them. The reporter told Michael that in the next edition of the paper, which would run in just a few days, they would publish this picture along with a write-up about his search and his contact information. Michael thanked them profusely, feeling a tiny spark of hope. He and his daughters got back in the car and headed back to Bow, East London to wait. Now, what Michael did not know was that at that exact same time, Lisa was actually beginning to think about finding him too. Lisa was now 31 years old, she was married, she had 3 kids of her own, and she had moved out of Sudbury to a neighboring town. She had been talking to her mother and her friends about how she should go about finding her dad because she wanted her kids to have a relationship with him. But like Michael, she did not have his contact information, she did not have his phone number, and when she searched for him on social media, he was not on there. One day in August, Lisa was at her office. She went into the break room to get a drink, and she saw a copy of the Suffolk Free Press sitting on the coffee table. She picked it up and began casually flipping through the pages. Suddenly, she stopped. She saw a picture of herself. In the background of the main photo, she could clearly see herself and her mother walking along the street. She had been in Sudbury just a couple of days earlier to talk to her mom about how to find her dad, and they had walked down that very street. But then Lisa looked at the main subjects of the photo, the people standing in the foreground. It was a middle-aged man and two teenage girls. She stared at the man's face and nearly fell off her chair. It was her father, Michael, and her two stepsisters, whom she had never met. She looked at the caption for the photo and read the article. It explained that this man was desperately searching for his daughter, Lisa, whom he had not seen in 10 years. Purely by chance, on the only day Lisa had been in Sudbury talking to her mother about finding her father, she had been walking literally 100 feet behind her father and her stepsisters as they were having their picture taken for the newspaper ad. The photographer had captured all of them in the same frame without even realizing it. Lisa immediately read the article, got her father's contact information, and reached out to him. Initially, when Michael answered the phone and Lisa told him who she was and how she found him, he actually thought it was a scam. He did not believe it was actually her. But eventually she convinced him and he drove right back to Sudbury. They had an incredibly emotional reunion and Michael got to meet his grandchildren for the very first time. Today, they are still a close part of each other's lives, all because of an unbelievable 1-in-a-million coincidence captured in a single newspaper photograph. That is a story of a long search ending in a beautiful, almost miraculous way. But our next story takes us to a very different part of the world where a man's search for fame and power led to something incredibly dark and deeply disturbing. If you were to picture the Amazon rainforest in your head, you would probably imagine a dense, green, tropical wilderness filled with exotic animals and winding rivers. And you would be right. That is a very accurate representation of the Amazon. But what a lot of people do not know is that the Amazon rainforest is also home to a massive, bustling city. It is called Manaus, and it sits right in the middle of the rainforest, right along the banks of the Amazon River. Manaus is a city of extremes, and unfortunately, it happens to be one of the most violent places in the entire world. In Manaus, the drug trade and gang violence are extremely prevalent. All it takes is walking down the wrong street or crossing the wrong person, and you can get shot or stabbed in broad daylight with virtually nothing anyone can do to stop it. The police are often overwhelmed, underfunded, and sometimes even complicit in the chaos. In 1989, a 31-year-old former police officer named Wallace Souza decided that he wanted to do something about the state of his hometown. He wanted to make a television show that would show people what it was actually like to live in Manaus. Now, there were other crime shows in Brazil at the time, but they often censored the most graphic content. They would blur out the bodies or avoid showing the true horror of the crime scenes. Wallace decided he was not going to do that. He felt that the only way to expose the harsh reality of life in Manaus was to show everything without any filter. So, that year, he launched a show called Canal Livre, which translates to Free Channel. True to his word, there was absolutely no filter on what went on the air. The show was shocking, raw, and incredibly graphic. Viewers were given a front row seat to freshly murdered victims, lying in the road, slumped over chairs in restaurants, or dead behind the steering wheels of their cars. The cameramen would zoom in on the fatal injuries, the blood spatter, and the faces of the deceased. They would show the grieving family members crying out in pain, completely raw and unedited. But in between these very dark, violent segments about gang killings and drug deals gone wrong, Canal Livre also had a much lighter, almost bizarre side. They would bring on local artists to talk about their work, or they would focus on down-on-their-luck families that needed help, using the show to raise money for them. And then, for seemingly no reason at all, there was a recurring segment where a puppet character would get into physical fights with a man selling bread. It was a totally strange, chaotic spectacle, and the people of Manaus absolutely loved it. Eventually, the show became incredibly popular, not just in Manaus, but across all of Brazil. Because Wallace was often on camera hosting the show, he became extremely famous and highly recognizable. When he walked down the streets of Manaus, people would see him and literally start clapping and cheering for him. He was seen as a hero who was brave enough to show the truth that the government wanted to hide. As his popularity grew, Wallace decided that he did not just want to report on crime, he wanted to fight it from a position of authority. On the air, he would constantly berate the government for failing to protect its citizens, and he would mock the police for their inability to catch criminals. Off the air, he decided to run for political office. He campaigned hard on a platform of law and order, promising to clean up the streets of Manaus. He was elected with a massive majority, and he quickly became one of the most beloved, influential, and trusted public figures in all of Brazil. However, over the years, there was one very strange thing about Canal Livre that some people began to notice. It was a detail that was hard to ignore, and it was most obvious in a now famous episode that aired in the mid-2000s. This particular episode opens with a Canal Livre reporter making their way through a dense patch of jungle. A cameraman is filming them from behind as they push branches out of the way and carefully step over the thick underbrush. Up ahead, there is a small clearing, and standing in this clearing is a third person who is looking down at something on the ground. The reporter finally makes his way into the clearing, and the cameraman follows, pointing the camera down at the ground. What you see on the ground looks like a black, charred log that is still smoking. But as the cameraman zooms in, you realize it is not a log at all. It is a human being. The body is badly burned and still actively smoking, meaning this person had been set on fire just minutes before the camera crew arrived. It was a horrifying sight. But then, the reporter starts talking about the victim with an incredible amount of detail. He tells the audience that the victim is a man, that he had not been shot, and that he had been doused with gasoline and burned alive. The problem was, the police had not even arrived at the scene yet. No medical examiner had looked at the body, and because the body was so badly charred, it was virtually impossible to tell just by looking at it whether the victim was male, whether there were gunshot wounds, or what accelerant had been used. When people began to question how Canal Livre always managed to arrive at these crime scenes so quickly, and how they had so much detailed information before the police, Wallace had a quick answer. He told them that they were simply a very popular show with a huge network of informants, that people called them before they called the police, and that they constantly monitored police radios and the city morgue. For a long time, people accepted this explanation. But everything changed in October of 2008. That month, the police arrested a former Manaus police officer who went by the name Moa. He was accused of committing 9 murders and was thrown into jail. Despite the incredibly serious charges against him, Moa seemed completely unfazed. He acted like a man who knew he had powerful connections on the outside, someone who would step in at any moment and get him out of prison. But as the weeks went on, nobody came to save Moa. He just continued to sit in his cell, and eventually the reality of his situation began to sink in. He realized he had been abandoned. So he decided to start talking, and the story he told would shock the entire nation of Brazil. Moa admitted to the police that he had killed several people. But then he said that he was just a hitman. He claimed that the person who was hiring him to commit these murders was none other than Wallace Souza. The police began a massive, secret investigation. What they discovered was absolutely mind-blowing. It turned out that Wallace Souza had started Canal Livre with good intentions, but as the show became massively popular, it gave him an immense amount of power and influence. And that power corrupted him completely. Wallace had secretly formed his own powerful drug cartel. In order to protect his drug territory, eliminate his rivals, and boost his television show's ratings, Wallace had started hiring hitmen like Moa to assassinate rival gang members. Wallace would tell the hitmen exactly who to kill, where to do it, and at what exact time. Once the hit was planned, Wallace would coordinate with his news producers. He would send his camera crews to the exact location of the planned murder, timing it so they would arrive either right as the crime was happening or immediately after. This allowed Canal Livre to get the absolute most graphic, exclusive footage before any other news outlet and long before the police could even secure the scene. They were literally creating the news they were reporting on. It took the police a full year to compile enough evidence, but in October of 2009, they finally charged Wallace Souza with murder, conspiracy, and drug trafficking. Wallace initially went on the run, but he eventually turned himself in, maintaining his innocence and claiming that he was the victim of a political conspiracy. However, Wallace would never stand trial. Before his case could go before a judge, he suffered a massive heart attack and died in prison in 2010. Because of his death, the full extent of his crimes was never fully revealed, and we will never know exactly how many people he had killed for the sake of his television ratings. But investigators were able to prove that at least 3 of the victims shown on Canal Livre had been killed directly on Wallace's orders, including the man who had been burned alive in the jungle. But the story does not end there. The person who paid the ultimate price for exposing this massive conspiracy was Moa, the hitman who had blown the whistle on Wallace. On New Year's Day in 2017, a massive violent prison riot broke out at the facility where Moa was being held. A powerful crime syndicate overran the guards and took control of the prison, and they had a specific list of targets they wanted to eliminate. One of those targets was Moa, whom they viewed as a traitor for cooperating with the police. An angry mob of armed inmates made their way to Moa's cell. When they found him, Moa was pressed flat against the back wall of his cell, as far away from the bars as he could possibly get, pleading for his life. The mob, armed with machetes and knives, began hacking at the cell door, trying to break the lock to get inside and cut him to pieces. But the lock was too strong, and they could not get the door open. Realizing they could not reach him with their blades, they decided to do something else. They reached through the bars with a lighter and set Moa's mattress on fire. The flames quickly spread, filling the tiny cell with thick, toxic smoke and intense heat. With nowhere to run and no way to escape, Moa was trapped. He was burned alive inside his cell, suffering the exact same horrific fate that he and Wallace had inflicted on their victims years before. This is a terrifying example of how greed and a desire for control can lead to absolute horror. But sometimes, control does not come from a drug cartel or a television show. Sometimes it comes from someone you trust completely, someone you consider to be your very best friend. And that brings us to our third and final story, which took place in Sydney, Australia. In 2010, an 18-year-old girl named Renee Marsden was living in Sydney with her parents and her 3 siblings. Renee was a very bright, outgoing, and popular young woman who had a large circle of friends. She was also incredibly close with her family, especially with her mother, Teresa. Teresa had given birth to Renee when she was only 19 years old. Because of their relatively close age gap as Renee grew into a young woman, their relationship evolved from a traditional mother-daughter dynamic into a deep, trusting friendship. Renee saw her mother as her ultimate confidant. She would come home and tell Teresa absolutely everything that was going on in her life, from her daily routines to her deepest secrets. In 2010, Renee was going through a very difficult time. She had been dating a young man for nearly 2 years, and she was madly in love with him. But one day, she discovered a series of text messages that made it clear he was cheating on her and did not really care about her. Renee was completely heartbroken. She confronted her boyfriend with the messages, but he completely denied sending them. He swore up and down that he had never cheated on her, that he loved her, and that he had no idea where those messages had come from. But Renee, feeling betrayed and confused, did not believe him. She felt she had no choice but to break up with him. During this painful period, Renee spent hours talking to her mother, crying and trying to process the end of her relationship. Teresa did her best to comfort her daughter, telling her that time heals all wounds and that she would eventually find the right person who would treat her with the respect she deserved. For a couple of weeks, Renee was deeply depressed. She barely wanted to leave her room. But then, quite suddenly, she came home from work one day and walked through the front door with a massive smile on her face. She was practically radiating happiness, which was a huge contrast to how she had been acting. Teresa immediately noticed the change and asked her what had happened to put her in such a great mood. Renee smiled and told her mother that she had met a new guy. Teresa was thrilled to see her daughter happy again, and she eagerly asked who this new person was. Renee explained that his name was Braden Spiteri. He was 23 years old, and he came from a very wealthy, prominent family. He had graduated from the King's School, which is an extremely prestigious boys' school in Sydney, and his father owned a highly successful construction company that Braden was set to inherit. Renee described him as handsome, kind, and absolutely perfect. Teresa asked how they had met, and Renee explained that her best friend, Camilla Zidon, had introduced them. Camilla and Renee had been best friends since high school, and Camilla was always over at the Marsden house, so Teresa knew her very well. Renee told her mother that Braden was actually Camilla's ex-boyfriend, but they had dated a long time ago, and there were absolutely no lingering feelings between them. They were just good friends now. According to Renee, Camilla had seen how depressed Renee was after her breakup, and she wanted to help her find happiness again. So, Camilla had set her up with Braden. When Teresa heard this, a small red flag went up in her mind. She knew that dating a best friend's ex-boyfriend could easily lead to drama and hurt feelings, even if everyone claimed to be fine with it. She looked at Renee and asked if she really thought it was a good idea to get involved with Camilla's ex. But Renee quickly brushed her concerns aside, saying that Camilla was completely supportive and just wanted her to be happy. Still feeling a bit uneasy, Teresa asked to see a picture of this new guy. Renee pulled out her phone and showed her a photo of Braden. He was indeed a very handsome young man with a bright, welcoming smile. But as Teresa looked closer at the photo, she noticed something that made her uncomfortable. In the picture, Camilla was leaning her head heavily on Braden's shoulder, looking very much like his girlfriend. Teresa kept her thoughts to herself, but she could not shake the feeling that this situation was complicated and potentially dangerous. Over the next few weeks and months, Renee's relationship with Braden seemed to blossom rapidly. They were texting each other constantly, day and night. Renee had her phone out almost 24 hours a day, smiling at her screen as she exchanged messages with Braden. But as the months went by, Teresa noticed something odd. Renee and Braden had still not met up in person since they began officially dating. Every single time they made plans to meet, something would come up at the last minute. Either Braden would have an emergency at work, or Renee would have a family conflict. It was always some seemingly legitimate excuse, but it happened every single time. Eventually, the couple stopped trying to arrange face-to-face meetings altogether. It was as if they had built this incredibly intense, emotional relationship entirely through their phone screens, and actually meeting in person had become too intimidating or awkward. They were completely content just living in this digital world together. This unusual text-only relationship continued for nearly a year until January of 2012, when a massive tragedy struck. Braden was involved in a horrific motorcycle accident. He survived the crash, but his passenger, who was also his best friend, a young man named Richie, did not survive. He was killed instantly. The police investigated the accident and determined that Braden had been driving recklessly, and he was subsequently charged with manslaughter. He was convicted and sentenced to 2 years in prison. When Teresa heard about the accident, she felt a complex mix of emotions. On one hand, she felt terrible for the young man who had lost his life and for Braden's family. But on the other hand, a protective, motherly part of her felt a sense of relief. She assumed that with Braden going to prison for 2 years, the relationship would naturally come to an end. She hoped that Renee would finally move on and find someone she could actually spend time with in the real world. But that is not what happened. Braden was sent to Goulburn Prison, a high-security facility located about 2 hours south of Sydney. Shortly after he arrived, Renee informed her family that Braden's family had somehow managed to smuggle a mobile phone into the prison for him. And just like that, their constant texting resumed, as if nothing had changed. Renee's family was deeply unhappy about this. They tried to talk to her, telling her that she was wasting her youth on a man in prison and that this relationship was heading down a very dark and difficult path. But Renee refused to listen. She was completely devoted to Braden. In fact, over the next several months, their relationship only grew more intense. They made plans to get married as soon as Braden was released, which was scheduled for late 2013. Renee was overjoyed and began throwing herself into wedding preparations. She spent hours online buying a beautiful wedding tiara on eBay, booking a professional photographer, and even contacting the Greek consulate to see if Braden, as a convicted felon, would be allowed to enter Greece for their planned honeymoon. But then, in August of 2013, just 2 months before Braden's scheduled release date, everything began to unravel in a very strange way. One afternoon, Teresa received a text message on her phone. It was from Braden, which was highly unusual because he rarely communicated with Teresa directly. The message was frantic. It told Teresa that she needed to check on Renee immediately because she was talking about ending her life. Terrified, Teresa ran straight to Renee's bedroom. She found Renee sitting quietly on her bed. Teresa sat down beside her, put a comforting hand on her shoulder, and asked if she was okay and what was going on. Renee looked up, seemingly confused, and said that she was fine, and asked why her mother was asking. Teresa showed her the text message from Braden. As soon as Renee saw the screen, her face fell. She let out a heavy sigh, looked at her mother, and said that they had just broken up and that their relationship was completely over. She insisted that she was not going to hurt herself, but that she was just incredibly sad. Teresa felt a sudden wave of relief mixed with deep sympathy for her daughter. She knew how painful breakups were, but she also believed that this was the best possible outcome for Renee's future. She stayed with Renee for a while, talking and comforting her until Renee seemed to calm down. Renee then told her mother that she wanted to go out that night with her friends to try and clear her head and forget about the breakup. Teresa thought this was a healthy idea. She sat on the bed and watched as Renee stood in front of the mirror, putting on her makeup and getting dressed up. When she was ready, Renee gave her mother a tight hug, kissed her on the cheek, and said she would see her later. Then she walked out the door. A few hours later, Teresa's phone buzzed. It was a text message from Renee. But as Teresa read the message, her heart sank. The text began with Renee saying how much she loved her mother and how sorry she was for the pain she was about to cause her. She wrote that if Teresa ever wanted to talk to her, she just had to call out her name and she would be there. Teresa was instantly gripped by panic. She did not fully understand what the message meant, but she knew it sounded like a goodbye. She immediately dialed Renee's number, but it went straight to voicemail. She called again and again, but there was no answer. She sent a desperate text message begging Renee to call her back, but she received no response. In a state of pure terror, Teresa called Camilla, Renee's best friend. She asked Camilla if she had heard from Renee or knew where she was. Camilla sounded shocked and told Teresa that she had actually just received a very similar frightening text message from Renee that simply said she loved her and was sorry. The two women decided they had to find her immediately. They met up and spent the next several hours driving frantically all over Sydney, checking every place they thought Renee might go. But there was no sign of her anywhere. Eventually, feeling completely helpless, they drove back to Teresa's house. By this time, Teresa's husband and Renee's siblings were all awake, gathered in the living room, waiting in agonizing silence for any news. At around 9:30 that night, there was a loud knock on the front door. Teresa ran to open it, hoping it was Renee. But instead, she was met by two police officers. The officers explained that they had found Renee's car parked in an unauthorized area, but she was not inside or anywhere near the vehicle. They had come to the family home to see if they knew where she was. When the family explained these suicidal text messages, the officers' faces grew grave. Without hesitating, Teresa and her husband ran to their car and drove straight to the location where the police had found Renee's vehicle. The car was parked in a beautiful but notorious area of Sydney known as the Gap. The Gap is a famous peninsula characterized by steep sandstone cliffs that drop directly into the churning ocean below. It is a place of incredible natural beauty, but it is also tragically well known as a site where many people go to end their lives. When the parents arrived, they rushed to Renee's car and searched it, but it was empty. They began running up and down the paved walking paths that lined the edge of the cliffs, calling out Renee's name into the dark, windy night. But there was no answer, only the sound of the waves crashing against the rocks far below. As Teresa searched, she climbed up to one of the highest lookout points on the cliff. There, on the ground, right in front of the safety fence designed to keep people away from the edge, she found something that shattered her heart. Placed neatly side by side on the gravel were Renee's flat black shoes. The police conducted an extensive search of the cliffs and the water below that night, but because of the darkness and the rough sea conditions, they could find no sign of Renee. The following day, investigators located a security camera that was positioned to monitor that specific section of the Gap. They pulled the footage from the previous night and began to watch. On the video, they saw Renee. She was walking slowly up the trail, alone in the dark. She stopped near the lookout point, bent down, took off her shoes, and placed them neatly together on the ground. Then she climbed over the safety fence. The fence was set back a few feet from the actual drop-off. The footage showed Renee taking a few steps toward the sheer edge and peeking over into the abyss. She looked visibly terrified. She took a few steps backward, pressing her back flat against the safety fence. She pulled out her phone and stood there for a few moments, typing. This was the moment she sent the 3 final text messages. One was to her mother, one was to Camilla, and one was to Braden. Once the messages were sent, Renee took her phone and threw it far out over the edge, watching as it disappeared into the ocean. Then she sat down on the ground and began to shimmy herself slowly forward toward the edge of the cliff until she went out of the camera's frame. It was clear to the investigators that Renee had jumped to her death. Despite search efforts, her body was never recovered from the ocean. The family was absolutely destroyed. They could not understand how a young woman who had been planning her wedding, buying a tiara, and looking forward to her future just days before could suddenly decide to end her life. They were convinced that the key to understanding her death lay with Braden Spiteri. They believed that whatever had happened during their sudden breakup had pushed her over the edge. They tried to contact Braden, but his phone was disconnected. Desperate for answers, they contacted the police and asked them to arrange a meeting with Braden at Goulburn Prison, where he was supposedly serving his sentence. The police agreed and contacted the administration at Goulburn Prison to inquire about an inmate named Braden Spiteri. But when the prison officials checked their records, they told the police something that sent a chill down their spines. They had no record of anyone named Braden Spiteri. Not only was he not currently at the prison, but no one by that name had ever been incarcerated there. The police began a deeper investigation into this mysterious young man. They traced the phone records, the social media accounts, and the IP addresses associated with Braden Spiteri. And what they uncovered was a level of deception that was almost impossible to comprehend. Braden Spiteri did not exist. He was a completely fictitious person. And the person who had created him, the person who had been texting Renee day and night for nearly 2 years, pretending to be the love of her life, was none other than her best friend, Camilla Zaiden. The photograph that Renee had shown her mother, the one where Camilla was resting her head on Braden's shoulder, was not a photo of Camilla's ex-boyfriend. It was just a photo of a completely random guy that Camilla had met once at a nightclub and asked to take a picture with. She had used his face to create this entire elaborate lie. As the police dug deeper into the girl's history, a horrifying pattern of toxic, obsessive control began to emerge. It turned out that Camilla had been deeply, pathologically possessive of Renee ever since they met in high school. She did not want anyone else to have Renee's attention or affection. When Renee had started dating her previous boyfriend of 2 years, Camilla had grown incredibly jealous. In order to destroy that relationship and regain control over Renee, Camilla had secretly fabricated the cheating text messages. She had created fake accounts, sent those messages to herself or to Renee, and then convinced Renee that her boyfriend was a liar and a cheat. Trusting her best friend completely, Renee had broken off the relationship exactly as Camilla had planned. Then, seeing how devastated Renee was, Camilla had swooped in to play the hero. She created the persona of Braden Spiteri, a wealthy, perfect man who would heal Renee's broken heart. Camilla had spent the next 2 years living a double life. She would spend the day hanging out with Renee in person as her best friend, and then spend the night texting Renee as Braden, whispering sweet, romantic things to her through a fake phone number. But the facade began to crack in June of 2013. During an intense text conversation with Braden, Renee had opened up about her frustrations with her real-life friend, Camilla. She told Braden that Camilla had become incredibly toxic, mean, and controlling, and that she was seriously considering ending her friendship with her. On the other end of the phone, Camilla was reading these messages. She was furious. She realized that despite all her efforts to control Renee, Renee was starting to see through her and wanted to push her away. Camilla's obsession turned into a dark desire for revenge. She decided that if she could not control Renee, she would destroy her. And she would use the character of Braden to do it. On the afternoon of the 5th of August, 2013, Renee was out having lunch with a coworker. She was happy, planning her future wedding, when she suddenly received a cold, abrupt text message from Braden out of the blue saying that he needed a break from her and that it was over. Renee was completely blindsided and devastated. She tried calling him repeatedly, but the call would not go through. Desperate and confused, she decided to do something she had never done before. She called Goulburn Prison directly, hoping to speak to a guard or an administrator who could help her get in touch with Braden. The call was placed at 2:45 that afternoon. While we do not know the exact details of the conversation, it is almost certain that the prison staff informed Renee that there was no inmate named Braden Spiteri at their facility. In that single, horrifying moment, the illusion shattered. Renee would have realized that the man she had loved for 2 years, the man she was planning to marry, was a total lie. And as she began to connect the dots, she would have realized that the person behind this cruel, elaborate deception was her very best friend, Camilla. The embarrassment, the shock, and the absolute betrayal were too much for Renee's 18-year-old mind to process. She felt completely violated, foolish, and deeply broken. She could not bring herself to confess this massive, humiliating truth to her mother, who was her confidant. The weight of the realization was so heavy that she felt she could not survive it. And so, later that evening, she walked out of her house and made the tragic journey to the Gap Cliffs. When the truth finally came out, Renee's family demanded justice. They wanted Camilla to be held criminally responsible for what she had done for driving their daughter to her death. But they were met with a harsh, frustrating reality. In Australia, as in many parts of the world at the time, there were no laws against catfishing. Creating a fake online persona and using it to deceive someone, even if it leads to devastating psychological harm, was not considered a criminal offense. Because Camilla had not physically forced Renee to jump, she could not be charged with any crime related to her death. Throughout the inquest and the media coverage that followed, Camilla refused to take any responsibility for what happened. She never apologized to Renee's family, and she never showed any remorse for the incredible devastation she had caused. Today, Renee's family is left with a profound, lingering grief and a sense of anger that may never truly fade. They are forced to live with the knowledge that the person who destroyed their daughter's life is walking free, completely unpunished by the law. The story of Renee Marsden is a haunting reminder of the dark side of our connected world. It shows us that the people we think we know, the people we let into our lives and our hearts, can sometimes be the very ones who are plotting our destruction. And it leaves us with the unsettling truth that sometimes the most horrific acts of cruelty can be committed without ever breaking a single law on the books. These three stories, from the miraculous reunion of Michael and Lisa, to the bloody, corrupt empire of Wallace Sousa, and finally to the tragic digital betrayal of Renee Marsden, show us the incredible spectrum of human behavior. They remind us of the power of our actions, the weight of the choices we make, and the enduring, sometimes devastating consequences that follow them. And the third story is the one that people still debate to this day. Because depending on your perspective, it might not even be considered a crime. Let me know your thoughts in the comments, and if you're not ready to stop, there's another story waiting for you right now.